crazy conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. Operation Cauldron. The year is 1952, and the British government has just started a secret trial of biological weapons. This secret operation involved scientists from both the Royal Navy and Porton-Down, and their job was to release biological agents onto caged monkeys and guinea pigs to see exactly what would happen. And the specific biological agents that these scientists were releasing onto these animals were the following: the pneumonic plague, the bubonic plague, brucellosis, and tularemia. The ultimate goal of these secret operations were to see what the actual effects would be on these animals to test their effectiveness in a warfare situation. But of course, it doesn't end there. This is only the beginning. And Britain isn't even the only government involved. Even though this entire operation is undertaken by Britain, these secret tests were actually a joint venture between the United States and Canada as well. And due to this collaboration, US documents actually later confirmed that this operation was not purely defensive in nature, like they tried to initially claim once they were exposed, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, when doing testing with extremely infectious diseases, especially when you're doing it in secret, you have to make sure that you're doing this in a way that is extremely covert and safe to ensure that nobody sees it and the spread of this disease does not go outside your test subjects. And for that reason, the British government decided that the best way to execute Operation Cauldron was by literally taking a floating pontoon, putting it off the coast of the Isle of Lewis, filling it with 83 monkeys and 3,492 guinea pigs, dragging them into the middle of the water, and then, once this worst recreation of Noah's Ark ever was in the perfect position, the biological agents that I mentioned earlier were then dispensed onto all of these animals. The first way they infected these animals was by suspending a bomb, which then infected everybody, and the second method was by literally just spraying them as well. And I mean, if they already were able to spray them, then why did they need the bomb? Regardless, once the biological agents were dispersed over all of the test subjects, the animals aboard were then taken onto a boat and then dissected to see their cause of death. I just want to quickly point out how crazy it is that the British government is literally testing out a bubonic plague biological weapon in an open air environment, like they didn't learn anything from the 1300s. Now here's the thing, after this initial test, Operation Cauldron was initially considered to be successful. The British government felt proud that they had just discovered a brand new biological weapon, and they also had a brand new way of testing biological weapons. But this is where things take a massive turn for the worst. The conspiracy theory here isn't the fact the British government killed an oddly specific amount of guinea pigs. What is what happened during the final series of tests of Operation Cauldron. During one of the very last tests of Operation Cauldron, a commercial fishing vessel accidentally drove directly through a cloud of plague bacteria on its way out of Britain to a fishing trip in the waters outside of Iceland. Now, to the British government's benefit, they did warn this fishing boat multiple times that there was an active military test going on, but the fishing boat ignored it and went right into the danger zone. Now, this is obviously a major concern. A commercial fishing vessel with 18 people on it has now just unknowingly traveled through a huge cloud of bubonic plague and other disease-filled gas. And the British government was extremely aware of this. So what did they do? Did they stop this fishing vessel for disinfection and medical examination to make sure that the fishermen were safe and that there was no spread of disease outside of these fishermen? Obviously not. The British government didn't tell this fishing vessel at all. Instead, what they decided to do was spy on this fishing vessel, turning these 18 crewmates into their brand new guinea pigs. For 21 days following the initial exposure, a British destroyer battleship was secretly observing the fishing vessel and also monitoring all of their radio communications, listening for any sort of medical distress calls. That alone is diabolical. But it gets worse, because during this time when this fishing vessel was being monitored, this fishing vessel was actually scheduled to stop at a port in England for a few days. And during this time, all of the crewmates would be getting off the boat and mingling with the general public. Now, obviously, this would be a huge health concern. So at this point, the British government finally intervened and told them what was going on, right? No. The British government allowed all of these 18 fishermen to mingle with the general public, further expanding their unconsensual human test subject pool. However, fortunately, nobody got sick. And because nobody got sick, and nobody outside a select handful of people involved in Operation Cauldron were aware of this, everybody involved swept Operation Cauldron under the rug, and for decades to come, Operation Cauldron was essentially not real. The government was successfully able to cover it up at the time, and most of the documents relevant to this case were actually burnt. And that is where the story would have ended. That was until rumors started floating around that eventually became a conspiracy theory. And by the time that these rumors and conspiracies were really starting to gain some traction, there was finally some investigation that was taking place. One of the first acknowledgments of this conspiracy was in 1979, literally 27 years after the experiment, when one of the MPs of the Western Isles, the area where this experiment took place, acknowledged this conspiracy and even questioned the defense secretary about them in Parliament. However, the defense secretary literally just said, quote, "They did not impinge in any way on the general public, and the case at that point was essentially closed. That was until 6 years later in 1985, when a whistleblower named Clive Ponting came across one of the files surrounding Operation Cauldron that had not been destroyed. And with Clive wanting the public to be aware about this crazy experiment, Clive anonymously told the Observer newspaper about it, which led to the Observer writing an article headlined, "British Germ Bomb Sprays Trawler." But even with this crazy story being exposed and making headlines, it was still not confirmed or acknowledged by the British government. 9 years later, in 1994, it was once again brought to Parliament, but shut down for being unsubstantiated. But then, finally, on January 21st, 2008, the Information Commissioner's Office ruled against the Ministry of Defense, forcing them to release everything they had about Operation Cauldron. And the biggest smoking gun that still existed was a 47-minute long video that showed the exact pontoon that was used and footage of exactly what happened on that pontoon. This 47-minute long video literally exposed everything, and at that point, it was confirmed 56 years later that this crazy conspiracy theory was actually the truth. The business plot. The year is 1933. Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, has just been elected as the 32nd president of the United States. However, some people are not happy about this election, specifically some of the most wealthy and powerful businessmen in America. Why were these wealthy businessmen upset about FDR becoming president? Well, that's because FDR had a major plan to implement social programs within the United States, along with other progressive policies, and most notably, a shift away from the gold standard. Now, with all of these new political changes about to be implemented under FDR, what do you think that these powerful businessmen did in retaliation? Do you think they maybe donated more money to the other party next time the election rolled around? Or do you think that they tried to organize a coup to overthrow FDR to have a fascist regime installed within the United States of America? Well, if you're watching this video, you know it's the last one. But let me explain. Smedley Butler is a retired military corps major general. And in 1933, he was retired and highly decorated, and also a very outspoken anti-war activist. Smedley Butler was generally respected, but was specifically adored by the veteran population within the United States, a population that was relatively large after World War I. And because all of the most wealthy and powerful businessmen were upset that FDR was about to fundamentally shift the country, at least in the eyes of these men, they decided that their best course of action was to orchestrate a coup and to have Smedley Butler be at the forefront of it. And the reason why they wanted Smedley specifically was because he was respected by veterans. And for that reason, if they could get Smedley on their side to spread their message, then these veterans would feel inspired to follow their ideology, and they could use that manpower to overthrow the government. That was the idea, at least. The first point of contact between these wealthy businessmen and Butler was when Gerald C. McGuire approached Butler and simply probed him about his stance on FDR to kind of get a temperature check on Butler. And Butler, assuming something was going on, kind of played along and acted like he wasn't on FDR's side when he actually was. And it was at that moment when Butler was aware that some of the most powerful businessmen were all on the same page about financing a private army, bringing all of this manpower armed directly to the White House, and then giving FDR a list of commands to submit to, and the business plot, aka the fascist regime, would be then installed. The crazy thing is, all they asked of Butler was to give a speech. This coup already had a plan on exactly how they would organize, finance, and manage this small army and overthrowing of the government. The only thing that they wanted Butler for was to give a pre-written speech at the American Legion Convention, with the hopes that the speech would resonate with these military veterans, causing them to join this coup, allowing these businessmen to follow through with their plan. And as a reward, these people would make Butler the fascist dictator of this new American regime. Now, fortunately, this was something that Butler had absolutely no interest in. And although he declined requests to give speeches on numerous occasions and also made it clear that he was anti-war and also anti-banker, these individuals were so stubborn and so certain that Butler was the man to help their dreams come true that they were very persistent. So persistent, in fact, that in 1934, only 1 year later, Butler testified under oath before the United States House of Representatives Special Committee on Un-American Activities, specifically about the revelations he had about this entire plot. But this is where things get a bit murky, because the initial conspiracy theory of was there American businessmen having secret conversations and planning a coup to overthrow FDR to reinstate the gold standard a real thing? Yes. And unless you believe that Butler was lying under oath, then that plot was absolutely confirmed to be true during Butler's testimony. But where things get murky and I guess unconfirmed was the exact length that this plan was actually going to go through. Because when this entire situation was initially exposed, a lot of powerful people, specifically the governor of New York and other politicians, tried to laugh it off as, oh, well, Butler is over-exaggerating this. This wasn't actually going to happen. These were just rich guys that were upset and they were just chatting ideas, but this wasn't real. And this sentiment by some is also confirmed by the ultimate decision of the Congressional Committee. One, because nobody was ever prosecuted when this was brought to light, and also the Congressional Committee final report said, quote, "There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have even been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient." But that's the issue. Might have been placed into execution. That plausible deniability gave these extremely powerful men an out to not be prosecuted, to not be further questioned, and also to allow them to have the story of, oh, no, that wasn't real, that was just an idea, when the plan ultimately failed and was exposed to the general public. Big Tobacco lied to you. In today's day and age, we know that smoking cigarettes has numerous side effects. We know that tobacco is bad for you. We know that inhaling carcinogens is not good for your lungs. And we know that nicotine is extremely addictive. Unfortunately, this is all now common knowledge and adults can make their decision on what they want to do. But prior to the 1990s, major tobacco companies had the general public in a chokehold, nearly convincing the world that smoking cigarettes was not only a good thing to do, but potentially even healthy for some situations. Now, the real paradigm shift around cigarettes happened in the 1990s, when whistleblowers were exposing the tobacco companies for all of the nefarious activities they were doing. However, that wasn't the first or only time that science proving cigarettes were bad for you actually came out. In the early 1950s, there were multiple scientific studies proving a link between cigarettes and cancer. And it was with the publishing of these studies that the American tobacco industry ramped up their marketing to the absolute next level to ensure their chokehold on the American public and to ultimately assert their dominance and maintain their fortune. But even before these studies came out, the marketing was still heavy. Like, for example, take the 1920s. During the 1920s, it was frowned upon for women to smoke. So for that reason, these tobacco companies took it upon themselves to shift the American mindset on women smoking so that these tobacco companies had 50% more consumers. And how they did this was crazy. Essentially, what these tobacco companies did was not only pay influential women to smoke in public settings and to be photographed and filmed smoking in public settings, but they even hijacked the women's rights movement from the 1920s to make their cigarettes seem like a way of fighting the patriarchy. And with the rise of feminism and empowering women, tobacco companies realized that if they could get their cigarettes involved in the movement, they would make a lot of money. And what they ultimately ended up doing was positioning cigarettes as a way to fight against the patriarchy, and they even eventually, in some ad campaigns, called cigarettes freedom sticks, empowering women to fight social norms by smoking cigarettes and being just like the men. That's the crazy level of manipulation we're talking about. But that's truly only the beginning. But I wanted to highlight that example because it's just insane. Another example of tobacco companies hijacking a movement was during World War II. In the early 1940s, smoking in public was actually banned in Nazi Germany because it was known that smoking was not good for you. So tobacco companies in America made smoking seem like they were anti-Nazi activities and patriotic in nature. Once again, hijacking a movement and profit that they knew would ultimately lead to deaths. But on top of hijacking women's rights movements or wartime movements, the tobacco industry was not a stranger to creative advertising. And the tobacco company Camel had some extremely notable advertisements specifically featuring doctors and dentists that literally said something along the lines of, "Most doctors smoke Camels," which is literally an endorsement from doctors to smoke cigarettes. And these ads ran for decades. And with that association of doctors and surgeons with cigarettes, obviously they have to be healthy, right? Oh, and let's not even forget the literal Flintstones cigarette ads, obviously aimed at targeting children to get interested in cigarettes as well. At this point, I know I'm not saying necessarily anything new, but I really want to emphasize this point that during this time, prior to all of the anti-tobacco messaging that most of us grew up with, or at least experienced and saw the shift in our lifetime, the perception of cigarettes was completely different in past times. And I'm really trying to emphasize that point, that how strong the marketing and propaganda was in the name of tobacco. Which leads us to the conspiracy theory at play. It was claimed that all throughout the early 1900s, from basically 1900 to the 1990s, Big Tobacco had no idea that there was any negative side effects of tobacco. They were claiming that through all of the research that they did, there was health benefits and negligible side effects to tobacco, and for that reason, they were doing nothing wrong in their marketing or advertising, and their product was completely fine. Now, obviously today, we know that's not true at all. Although, at the time, the conversation was still ongoing, and it was up for people to decide whether they wanted to believe reports that were not typically marketed, or the marketing that was shoved down their throats on a daily basis. In 1964, when another major report came out, once again directly linking lung cancer in cigarettes, did these tobacco industries do anything to change their blend? Did they potentially stop selling their products? Did they recognize what they were doing was hurting people? Of course not. What they decided to do was double down, and not only buy their own studies and buy their own doctors, but they decided to go on marketing campaigns that specifically planted seeds of doubt in the consumer's mind to essentially try to nullify any genuine articles coming out against cigarettes. And I'll tell you what, these tobacco companies had much more of a marketing budget than any independent researcher could ever dream of. And it was for that reason that Big Tobacco was able to have this reign for so long. So even though real articles were coming out proving that cigarettes were detrimental to your health, for every one study that was coming out, the tobacco industry was paying for hundreds, flooding the market with conflicting information, allowing people to never come to a real conclusion. And on top of that, the tobacco industry was also actively trying to discredit any doctor who was personally speaking out against tobacco to once again lower their credibility. In the eyes of the general public, if you listened to Big Tobacco's propaganda and took it at face value, it would seem like they're doing everything right. As studies were coming out, they made sure to do their own independent studies to try to confirm or dispute those claims. And they were also actively trying to make as many improvements as possible to cigarettes, specifically adding filters and whatnot. And on top of this, Big Tobacco even created its own health committee to investigate tobacco even further, to ensure that the product that they were selling was 100% healthy. But these smoke and mirrors, no pun intended, could not go on for long. In 1996, Jeff Wiggins became one of the most famous whistleblowers in American history, when he provably exposed the tobacco industry for not only manipulating nicotine levels in tobacco to increase its addictiveness, as well as adding other chemicals such as ammonia, but also for intentionally falsifying reports and also hiding reports that proved cigarettes were dangerous for many decades. I'll be honest, at first I was kind of hesitant to add this into this video because I know that people are so aware now of how bad cigarettes are and how manipulative the cigarette industry can be. But I wanted to reiterate some key examples and also make the point extremely clear that there was once a time when people believed the propaganda from cigarette companies. And there was multiple decades where the cigarette companies had the American public and the world in a chokehold, specifically because of their targeted propaganda. And it has taken many decades, banning of advertisements, multiple whistleblowers, numerous studies proving the link between tobacco and cancer, just to try to make a dent in the massive narrative that the tobacco company built for the last near century. But yeah, it literally changed how Americans perceived marketing and corporations forever. And for that reason, I thought it was worth keeping in this video. But let's move on. The Oak Ridge experiments. At this point, everybody and their grandmother knows about Project MKUltra, and we've even talked about it in this exact series. But did you know that Canada had its own secret MKUltra project and is still currently being investigated by the Canadian government? That's right, it is called the Oak Ridge experiment. Oak Ridge for years was the only forensic hospital in Ontario for people that were deemed criminally insane. And for that reason, Oak Ridge was the place that people were sent to who truly needed a psychiatric recalibration. And it was believed that the new experiments that were going on within the Oak Ridge walls were beneficial. The Oak Ridge experiments start with a doctor named Elliot T. Barker, who was a newly graduated psychiatrist out of the University of Toronto. And ever since graduating school, he was inspired by Dr. Maxwell Jones, who developed the concept of therapeutic community as a treatment for mental illness. And essentially what therapeutic community was having the mentally ill patient take an active part in their own treatment. But not only that, play an active role in the treatment of others as well, basically creating some sort of group healing. Now that on the surface may not seem evil per se, it's interesting, especially for the 1950s, it's at least something to potentially consider, but what stemmed out of this initial inclination turned into something truly evil. After graduating, but before arriving at Oak Ridge, Baker traveled around the world visiting interesting places, notably Chinese prison camps, to see how they controlled people with behaviors. When Barker finally arrived in Oak Ridge in 1965, he had his perfect plan in mind. And his great idea was to combine truth serums, sensory deprivation, and patient-led encounter groups to force psychopaths to confront their mental illness. Already off to a rough start, and I'm sure you can kind of already see the MKUltra comparisons. But trust me, we're only getting started. One of the first major issues with Oak Ridge was the fact that they were completely understaffed, which was one of the big incentives for hiring patients as therapists. They were basically having the prisoner patients that were already at Oak Ridge to now act as the caretaker or therapist for other patients. Essentially, the blind leading the blind. But it wasn't just talk therapy that these prisoner patients were having with each other. At Oak Ridge, you could order a drug treatment for another patient just because you wanted to see what would happen. And that includes ordering somebody else LSD, methamphetamine, or even some of their truth serums. And they even offered alcohol therapy. Interestingly, they knew that the alcohol wasn't going to cure mental illness, but what they figured would happen was that the alcohol would lower the mental defenses of these patients, forcing them to examine their own shortcomings, ideally allowing them to become aware of their mental illness, and then at that point becoming cured. That was the mindset, at least at the time. And while it's an interesting hypothesis at best, this was taken as truth and implemented in the worst way possible. The experiments that took place under Barker at Oak Ridge became more and more depraved and more unconsensual, and typically included patients with numerous experimental drug treatments multiple times a day, essentially keeping the inmates drugged out of their mind to the point of psychosis. One of the men that was held at Oak Ridge said the following, quote, "They gave you 6 shots a day of that stuff. By the end of the day, you didn't know who you were or what you were doing. You can't do that to people over and over and call it treatment, because that's just a nice word that people want to hear. The real word is torture, because that's all it was, beginning to end." And the experience that one man had within Oak Ridge was not uncommon. That was essentially the norm. But on top of just injecting drugs into prisoner patients, they also took it a step further. Barker shortly after invented something known as the Total Encounter Capsule. And essentially what it was a windowless room with padded walls, no furniture, and only an open toilet. There was no lights, there was one hole for food, and that was it. Prisoners would be sent in this room naked and would be in there alone in the dark for as long as 10 days at a time. Now, similar to MKUltra, the point of these experiments were to try to break the mind of the individual. Although with MKUltra, the goal was mind control, and with the Oak Ridge experiments, the goal, at least allegedly, was to help solve mental illness through what ended up just being torture. What's really interesting was that the Oak Ridge experiments at the time weren't necessarily even a secret. People weren't just extremely privy to it. And for those who were in the know, specifically in the psychiatric community, Elliot Baker seemed like somebody who was doing innovative work, and his experiments were considered avant-garde, interesting. And because at the time so little was known about mental health, this was seen as a great opportunity to learn. And people even believed that these treatments could potentially be beneficial, which obviously was not the case at all. But it still continues to get worse. Another major issue that was happening at Oak Ridge was because it was gaining popularity through the experimental treatments that were happening in it, the government was becoming more and more open to sending lesser criminals there. And it even got to the point where mischievous teenagers that were getting caught up in trouble were given the option to either serve prison time or go to Oak Ridge. And if you don't know what's going on behind Oak Ridge, anything sounds better than prison. And keep in mind, these people weren't murderers. These were like kids that were doing drugs and stealing cars. Not good, but there's a difference. But here's the thing. These teenagers that ended up getting sent to Oak Ridge had the same experience as these other criminals, coupled with the fact that not only were they tortured all day themselves, but they were also surrounded by extremely mentally ill people that were also tortured. And it goes without saying that the environment was extremely hostile, specifically because staff was low and security was almost non-existent. Patients had to fend for themselves, and in some cases, they were literally taking care of each other. Although I use the term taking care of lightly, because they were responsible for each other, but nothing beneficial was happening. And unfortunately, some extremely depraved things were happening. But in case that isn't bad enough, in 1976, another forensic unit was opened, this time for women. I guess I forgot to mention it, but Oak Ridge was only for men. So they opened another location specifically for women. The location opened with 30 extremely mentally ill women. And unfortunately, these women were subject to the same conditions as Oak Ridge, but there was something worse happening. Because while at Oak Ridge, inmates were taking care of each other, in this new all-female facility, they decided that it would be smart to take some of the men from Oak Ridge to bring them to this new female facility, giving these men the role of therapist. That's right, some of the most dangerous men in Canada, a lot of which who were in Oak Ridge for sexual-related crimes, who have been tortured for the last few years, are now going to be sent to an all-women's facility with low security to act as some sort of authoritative figure. I'm sure you can only imagine what happened, and unfortunately, it was probably even sadder than you could possibly imagine. So yeah, we all know about MKUltra, but in the 1960s and 70s in Canada, the exact same things were going on. To me, this reminds me a lot of the whole lobotomy thing. It got very popular and was interesting for a while, but ended up just being something that was not cool whatsoever. There's actually an interview from 1993 where Elliot Barker goes on record on camera defending his work at Oak Ridge, saying that, quote, "It was the reasonable thing to do at the time." And he also now resents the fact that he has to try to defend himself or his work. And that's because even in the 1990s, when people were becoming more and more privy to what was happening, they saw exactly how hellish the conditions truly were. The Oak Ridge experiments went on for over 15 years. And the ultimate result was absolutely no psychiatric development. Today, the Ontario Superior Court judge has officially condemned the experiments at Oak Ridge as flagrant and outrageous. But even still, with hindsight being 2020, how does a psychiatrist who's going to Chinese labor camps to investigate behavior control and putting convicted rapists into a female mental asylum as therapists seem like a good idea in any world to anybody? That's what I'm asking. And like I said, I know hindsight's 2020, but who thought these were good ideas? Not to mention all of the forced drugging and sensory deprivation of these psychiatric patients and prisoners. On June 25th, 2020, a civil lawsuit brought by 28 former patients of Oak Ridge sought justice from Barker and his partner for subjecting them and every other patient of Oak Ridge to unethical and degrading human experimentation from 1966 to 1983. And in August of 2022, a unanimous 3-judge panel sided with the victims of Oak Ridge and awarded general and punitive damages to the victims in the range of $1,000 to $2.7 million for the 28 patients. This decision not only brings some semblance of justice to the victims of Oak Ridge, but it is also a massive win for transparency, accountability, and ultimately the greater mental health movement. Although it is unfortunate unfortunate that justice was served so many years later, and that any of this even happened in the first place. The craziest things ever seen in space. The Oh My God particle. It is October 15th, 1991, and you and your best scientist bro are hanging out at the Fly's Eye Observatory in Utah. You're doing what you do every evening. You're looking into space for ultra-high energy cosmic rays, trying to find something cool and learn more about the universe. This night was like any other night, if not quieter. There was no new discoveries and nothing to even observe whatsoever. And while you and your scientist buddy were just throwing back scientific beers, you notice a light blinking on your desk. And it's a signal that the Fly's Eye Observatory is picking up something strong. And because this is the most action you've had all night, you decide to take a look at the data. And what you see on the chart blows your mind. As your scientific jaw drops to the scientific floor, all your scientific buddy could say is, "What do you see?" And while thoughts and ideas were bouncing around your mind at 1,000,000 miles per hour, the only words you could utter were, "Oh my God." Later leading to the name of this now iconic particle. The Oh My God particle, which has no relation to the God particle, which came later, was an ultra-high energy cosmic ray that was obviously detected by the Fly's Eye Observatory in Utah in 1991. And at the time, the Oh My God particle was the highest energy cosmic ray ever to be observed. And as of today, in 2026, that record has still yet to be broken, making this particle very fitting of its name. Now, interestingly and somewhat unsurprisingly, this experimental observatory that was built on a military base in Utah was actually specifically built for this one purpose. The so-called high-resolution Fly's Eye detector was literally meant to only capture ultra-high energy cosmic rays, and that it definitely did. You see, the reason why the Oh My God particle is so significant and the reason why it was so shocking to the scientists who first observed it is because it wasn't only just an anomaly or something that was rare. The energy and speed in which the Oh My God particle possessed was thought to be scientifically impossible prior to its discovery. And even after its observation, it was highly questioned and thoroughly ensured that this wasn't just a miscalculation. For a bit more context, we don't quite know what type of particle the Oh My God particle was, although we can assume that it was a proton due to the fact that nearly 70% of high energy cosmic rays are protons. However, fortunately, what we do know is the sheer insane power that this mysterious particle possessed. For starters, the collision energy of the Oh My God particle was 40 million times more powerful than the highest energy protons ever produced in the world's strongest particle accelerator. That's right. This one random particle was literally 40 million times stronger than the strongest particle that we intentionally accelerated on Earth. And while that obviously is impressive, it's also a bit deceiving. Because although it technically had 40 million times more energy, not all of that energy was available. And the definition of availability in the context of particle collision essentially means the amount of energy that is actually able to create new particles in the event of a collision. And it's been calculated that in the event of an actual particle collision, the Oh My God particle would have had roughly 200 times more energy than the most energetic particle in the world's best particle accelerator. Which is, once again, still impressive, but not 40 million times more impressive. But we've still got more stats to discuss. Going back to the type of particle that the Oh My God particle even is. Assuming that this particle was a proton to begin with, we can assume its rest mass and do the following calculation to determine how fast the particle was going. I'm not even going to try to pretend to understand what I'm looking at right now, but this is the calculation that scientists use to calculate the speed in which one of these particles is traveling. And I suppose, using this specific formula, assuming that the particle was a proton, then it's safe to assume that this particle is literally traveling at 0.999999999999999999957 times the speed of light. Basically a tiny fraction less than the literal speed of light, which is obviously insane, but we're still not done. The Oh My God particle wasn't only fast and energetic, it was also photogenic, or at least photongenic. And what I mean by that is that the Oh My God particle literally had 100 quintillion times more photon energy than visible light, which is honestly hard to even conceptualize. But just to put it into context, here's a side-by-side comparison. The Oh My God particle was 20 million times more photongenic than the highest photon energy measured ever in electromagnetic radiation. I think it goes without saying that the Oh My God particle has definitely earned its name, and just by looking at its stats, it's hard to imagine how rare this type of particle even is. And I do understand that this first section was very much so technical and in the weeds, and these numbers really didn't mean much, but hopefully, if nothing else, the massive multipliers of all of these numbers kind of just goes to show how insane the God particle was, even if you're like me and know nothing about particles at all. The God particle was something really cool that was seen in space, and we're only just getting started. The Boötes Void. The year is 1981. You are an astronomer working alone, once again, late at night. Today was like any other day, and you were tasked with doing a galactic survey of redshift in the universe. And while the specifics of a redshift survey doesn't matter, what does matter is what you are about to discover. As you are surveying the universe, you notice something you have not seen before. Your monitoring device has gone from receiving a lot of information to essentially no information in the matter of a few degrees. And while at first it looks like the tool you're using has simply stopped working or is no longer working correctly, but after moving it and recalibrating it, you notice that you are getting the same results. To you, this is interesting because this almost reminds you of what happened when you go over a void in the universe. However, this void is different. It's nowhere near the size of the voids you've measured in the past, leading you to believe it's not a void. Although, upon further inspection, you realize that you haven't just discovered a new void in the universe, you have just discovered the largest known void in the visible universe. And this void is so big, in fact, that it's known as the Great Nothing. This is a terrifying start, and we're only just getting started. In the first section, we talked about so many numbers and facts about something that was very much so real and happening. But the Boötes Void is literally the exact opposite. The only numbers I can discuss are the numbers representing the lack that exists within this void. You see, as you look at a map of universe, the more and more you zoom out, the more and more you notice a sort of web or filament structure that exists through all of the superclusters of galaxies in the visible universe. Obviously, the natural byproduct of this web-like structure is the voids or gaps between these clusters. These voids alone aren't necessarily rare, and they're not completely empty either. They do contain smaller galaxies, although they're not nearly as populated as the superclusters that are more observable. Although the reason why the Boötes Void is so significant is, well, of course, because of its sheer size. From one end to another, the Boötes Void is 330 million light years across. Of course, meaning if you were traveling at the speed of light, it would take you 330 million years to cross it. Now, for context, if the Boötes Void wasn't a void and was actually a supercluster, it would be safe to assume that this area of universe could contain up to 2,000 galaxies. However, because the Boötes Void is, well, a void, it only contains just 60 galaxies, which, relatively speaking, means it's more or less empty. As of right now, the center of the Boötes Void is 700 million light years from Earth. Although, interestingly, if the Milky Way galaxy was put smack dab in the middle of the Boötes Void, astronomers on Earth would not have known about any other galaxy until the 1960s. Because of the sheer lack of anything around our galaxy, any technology prior to the 1960s would not have been able to detect any other galaxies. And I can only imagine the scientific revelation happening in the 60s if we were in the middle of the void and had just discovered a new galaxy for the first time. And while voids are common and natural in the universe, something about this void being extremely large is, at the very least, eerie. And just some small part, terrifying. Dark galaxies. The year is 1984, and you and your fellow astronomer are in the observatory currently overlooking the Virgo cluster. The Virgo cluster is of particular interest to you because you think it looks cool. But what you are on the verge of discovering goes far beyond just being cool. As you are looking through the Virgo cluster, you notice a weird phenomenon. As you point your telescope in a specific direction, you notice that your telescope appears to be looking at, well, nothing in particular. However, all of your equipment seems to be suggesting that you are looking at a galaxy. This is obviously perplexing because you can see directly that there is no galaxy in your direct line of sight. However, all of the data you are getting seems to be telling a different story. As you look closer through the telescope, you can see a few galaxies in the distance, and perhaps your devices are mistaking two galaxies for one larger, closer galaxy, although based on all of the information you're getting, it appears that you are looking at a galaxy that you almost can't see. And that's when it hits you. You are looking at a galaxy, but you're looking at a galaxy no one has ever seen before. A galaxy known as a dark galaxy, or an ultra-diffuse galaxy. Dark galaxies are quite interesting, and it's taken nearly 30 years of studying them to have a significant amount of information on them. However, the more we study dark galaxies, the more we are left with questions rather than answers. As I described in the intro story, which I totally just made up, I have no idea if that's how astronomy equipment works, it was discovered that yes, dark galaxies are such a thing. Although not much was known about them at the time. Although fast forward to the modern day, we now know a lot more about these interesting and rare galaxies. Dark galaxies or ultra-diffuse galaxies are known as such because they are extremely low in luminosity. They don't produce a lot of light, and they are very hard to see. They're so hard to see, in fact, that they're actually sometimes referred to as see-through galaxies, because it is actually easier to see galaxies further in the distance behind them than it is to see the actual galaxy itself. And the reason why these dark galaxies are so dark is due to their lack of star-forming gas, which results in these galaxies having fewer new stars and being almost exclusively full of old, dying stars. For reference, here's an example on screen. This is a picture of NGC 1052 DF2, and it's a dark galaxy that was discovered in 2018, and we'll discuss it more later, but you basically can't see it. For reference, this is the Milky Way, obviously the iconic swirly ball of light that we all associate with the term galaxy. As you can tell, one of these galaxies is not like the other. Although interestingly, they're not as different as they may seem. Dark galaxies typically have a similar size to our Milky Way. However, the mass of these dark galaxies is much more similar to galaxies that are way more tiny than the Milky Way. For reference, the Milky Way is estimated to have anywhere from 200 to 400 million stars. Although a dark galaxy of the same size would only have roughly 1 billion stars, compared to the nearly 400 billion the Milky Way has. That fact alone makes the whole see-through aspect of a see-through galaxy make a lot more sense. But it definitely doesn't answer every question we have about dark galaxies. From their original discovery in 1984 to the modern day, scientists have observed two opposite traits when it comes to dark galaxies. Some dark galaxies, unsurprisingly, contain an extreme amount of dark matter, and it's believed by scientists that some literally consist almost primarily of dark matter due to the lack of stars. Now, dark matter being present in a galaxy is not surprising whatsoever, and it's believed by most scientists that dark matter is a necessity for galaxies to form. Now, that's all fine and well until you understand that in recent years, like we're talking 2018, there has been dark galaxies that have been discovered with basically no dark matter whatsoever. And what this means, honestly, I don't know, besides the fact that we really don't know much about dark galaxies. But of course, the mystery doesn't end there, because while some dark galaxies have almost all dark matter and some dark galaxies almost have no dark matter, the common denominator between both dark galaxies is the fact that we don't know how they're formed. There are some scientists that theorize that these galaxies are old and formed from the earliest galaxies, which is why they are out of star-forming gas. But yeah, these galaxies are rather mysterious and elusive, and almost kind of seem like the ghosts of galaxies, because you can barely see them, they're translucent, we don't know how they're formed, they're on either end of the extreme when it comes to dark matter, and we still don't know a ton about them. And I guess one more funny fact about dark galaxies, which has nothing to do with the galaxy itself, is that if you go to the Ultra Diffuse Galaxy Wikipedia page, you will see that it's discovered by two men, Alan Sandabich and Bruno Bengelli. And if you hover over Alan's name, it'll show you a picture of him and tell you about all of his credentials. You know, American astronomer from California, blah, blah, blah. But if you hover over Bruno, there is no picture, and all it says is, Bruno Bengelli is a Swiss curler. And I can only assume this is like an incorrect hyperlink, but if this is accurate, that's kind of hilarious. And it also reminds me of that one like Impractical Joker sketch where Q and Murr are giving a presentation, and Q gives all of his credentials when introducing himself, and then Murr has to introduce himself as Dandy Chiggins with no qualifications whatsoever. But yeah, dark galaxies are weird, and for the longest time, we didn't even know they were there. Rogue planets. Have you ever been laying on your bed on a Friday night, no texts on your phone, no messages, no calls, just you watching your favorite YouTube video, eating a snack, all by yourself? To some, that sounds like an absolute nightmare. And to some, that sounds like pure bliss. But the common denominator in both situations is that you are alone, or lonely. And while some of us experience loneliness more than others, nobody on this planet could imagine, let alone experience, the loneliness that a rogue planet experiences. When you think of planets, obviously you think of rock or gas formations floating around a sun, and in most cases, that is exactly what a planet is. But what if I told you there was a nearly countless number of planets that had no sun and no orbit whatsoever? They are simply flying aimlessly through space. No friends, no direction, just inertia and loneliness. Now, I actually want to take a step back and unpack this a bit, because if you listen closely, you'd notice I say nearly countless number of rogue planets, and that is the case. For context, in the Milky Way alone, as I mentioned earlier, there's anywhere from 200 to 400 billion stars. And let's say on average, there's 5 planets orbiting each of those stars. Assuming there is 400 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy, that would mean that there is 2 trillion planets in our Milky Way galaxy that are orbiting stars. That alone is an insane number. However, it is estimated by scientists and astronomers that there is likely more rogue planets in the Milky Way than there is stars and starbound planets planets in the Milky Way combined. I don't know about you, but to me, that information when I first heard it was insane. And it's probably even more insane if you are just now hearing about rogue planets for the first time. But the lore goes deeper. For starters, we need to discuss how these lone wolf planets even come to be. And there is actually two primary methods. The first method of rogue planet creation actually starts with a starbound planet. You see, sometimes when a planet in a solar system is misbehaving, other planets gang up to use their gravitational powers to eject that planet from the solar system. And in case the term gravitational powers wasn't enough of a giveaway, I just made that up. But the truth isn't too far from that fiction. There are very real instances where gravitational interactions happen between planets in solar systems that end up ejecting planets from solar systems entirely, leading them on a brand new trajectory that has no formal orbit, turning a once starbound planet into a rogue planet, completely shifting life as that planet had known it. The other way that rogue planets are formed are through the same process that stars used to form. The only difference is, however, that rogue planets that form through this process do not gain the mass required to become a star and do not essentially ignite, turning into, well, what a star becomes. And interestingly, it's believed that most of the rogue planets are formed through this method. And most of the planets that form through this method are large gas giants, unsurprisingly, and they're actually typically warm, not the freezing cold wasteland you would assume a rogue planet to be. Now, interestingly, there is some debate on whether or not planets formed through this method are actually planets or if they're brown dwarf stars. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to consider them planets. Also because these rogue planets are really the only rogue planets we have information about. Simply because these massive gas giant rogue planets are the easiest to observe and study because they are somewhat just barely visible due to their size and small amount of light, which is in direct contrast to the smaller rock planets that are essentially invisible to image detection used by astronomers. And it's for that reason that studying rogue planets is extremely hard. They have no known trajectory, they don't even have a purpose, there's nothing around them, no light source, and they are simply lone wolves on their own mission. So just remember that if you ever feel lonely laying in your bed, there are planets in our very galaxy that are light years from any solar system, and even those solar systems that they are closest to are still impossibly far away, and also not their home. And their home was either a place that they were rejected from or never even had in the first place. But in case you feel rejected or like you need a home, feel free to subscribe to the Trust Me Bro channel, because we are always accepting new bros, and we have the best community on YouTube. Oh, and we also post cool videos every Friday. So if you like videos like this one, definitely feel free to subscribe, and maybe even like the video if you want a part 2 about crazy things in space. But enough of that, back to the video. The Space Angels. The year is 1984, and you are a Russian cosmonaut aboard the Soviet space station, Salyut 7. Aboard the space station with you are 2 fellow cosmonauts, and the 3 of you were on the space station to conduct low-orbit experiments. But while spending time in space and working as an astronaut may seem like a dream come true to many, to you and your team, your time in space was anything but pleasant. During your time on the space station, you and your team experienced fuel leaks, loss of power, and other critical errors that demanded a lot of mental and physical attention. And it was for that reason, near the end of your trip, you were excited to come home. Although, in one of the final days on your stay in the Soviet space station, you and your 2 colleagues experienced something you have never seen before. The day was ending like any other. However, you were noticing something your colleagues were not. It almost seemed like the cabin of the space station was filling up with some sort of orange dust. Not physical dust, but almost a thick orange light. But almost after you began to process what you could be looking at, you notice a bright light filling the cabin. And this light was observed not only by you, but by the 2 other cosmonauts as well. But the bright light that filled the cabin seemed almost blinding, and you had to shield your eyes. That is, until moments later, it appeared to subside, and you decide to look out the window of the space station to see what is going on. And it is at this moment when you and your cosmonaut colleagues look out the window and see something you have never seen before. These massive figures seem to have wings, faces, and they are comparable to the size of multi-story buildings. They are a bright orange light, and they have a calm, smiling demeanor and appear to just be observing the station. At first, you had to imagine that you were simply losing your mind, although when your 2 colleagues confirmed that they had seen the same thing, you were all left in awe, as what you have just seen seemed impossible. And only moments later, what you had just been looking at was gone, and you were only left with the memory of one of the most insane things you could ever see in space. Not many days after this experience, you are picked up from your ship and brought home, and once home, you begin to retell the story of what you saw, and the legend of the Space Angel of Salyut 7 begins. For the last entry on this video, I definitely wanted to kind of switch it up, and obviously this isn't a scientific discovery. This is definitely more or less of a debated phenomenon that is still not understood to this day. And well, I wanted to leave things, I guess, on a cliffhanger. Unlike every other entry in this video, this sighting or reporting wasn't discovered by a scientist on ground. It was discovered by a cosmonaut literally in a space station. And for those who don't know, a cosmonaut is simply a Russian astronaut. Now, back to this insane story. Every single member of the crew that was on the space station confirmed that they saw these massive angels for multiple minutes, and each one of them told the exact same story about what they saw. Now, interestingly, when they came back to Earth to tell the story of what they saw at the end of their trip, it was all written off almost immediately. People were claiming that they all shared the same hallucination. And for that reason, this information wasn't necessarily made public until the fall of the Soviet Union years later. Interestingly, these glowing angelic figures were not only seen by the first crew of Salyut 7, and it was reported that another crew years later also witnessed the exact same phenomenon. Although the scientific community was very quick to strongly reject any sort of supernatural beings actually being present during this sighting. One of the theories that scientists presented to try to make sense of this entire situation was that what they were seeing was an extreme case of atmospheric and optical effects combined with human perception under stress. Now, it was known that the missions that these crews embarked on the Soviet space station were not pleasant in the slightest. They both encountered numerous issues, and also being in space in general is not an easy task, and it's for that reason that it's not unlikely for there to be some sort of, well, mind tricks at play, but that doesn't explain everything. And another theory suggests that there is probably some sort of rare plasma or aura-like phenomenon reacting with sunlight at the orbital altitude that the space station was at, creating this interesting visual phenomenon, which isn't impossible, but it's also not confirmed. This story, while interesting, has no concrete ending and is kind of still to this day open to interpretation. And in the comments below, I kind of want to start a conversation of what you guys think this could be. I know I didn't give too much information, but if multiple groups of cosmonauts saw the same thing on multiple times, could it be that they were all simply sharing a hallucination? Could it be that they were all under the same mental stress? Could it be the perfect Goldilocks zone for some sort of plasma-induced light? Or was there something more at play here? I personally have no idea, and this could be supernatural or nothing of the sort. And maybe all of these cosmonauts were just lying just for a gag, but realistically, we don't know, and the truth is we likely never will. Which, for that reason, might make this the craziest and potentially scariest entry on the entire list. Crazy cults that are still active today. The Church of God with signs following. Have you ever been in a standard run-of-the-mill Christian church and just thought to yourself, wow, this is really missing something? This is missing a lot of venomous snakes. Well, if you have, surprisingly, you wouldn't be the first, and you would also be a perfect candidate for the Church of God with signs following, which in itself is just a strange name. But trust me when I say that the name is the least strange thing about this cult. Members of the Church of God with signs following are either holiness or Pentecostal Christians, which at a glance may seem normal. However, it's the specific rite or ritual that the Church of God with signs following focus on that makes their congregation so odd. To put it bluntly, one of the core elements of the Church of God with signs following is serpent handling. Specifically the belief that if you are a true Christian, you should easily be able to handle a venomous snake or serpent of any variety without suffering any negative consequence. And in case handling the snake is not enough, you should also be able to consume venom from these venomous snakes completely issue-free. And spoiler alert, there was issues. But before we get too into the weeds on incidents, let me give you some history. The religious practice of snake handling goes all the way back to the 2nd century, when the Ophites reportedly handled snakes during their services and also worshipped serpents. And the tradition has also been seen in ancient Egypt. But the tradition of handling snakes for religious purposes didn't appear in the United States until 1910. And this practice is generally associated with the ministry of George Went Hesley, a minister from Tennessee. George was originally a minister at the Church of God. However, in 1922, he resigned, citing troubles at home, and decided to take his ministry on the road. Through the late 1920s and even 1930s, George traveled through the southeast United States, resuming his ministry as a traveling preacher, promoting both God and the specific practice of serpent handling. Now, interestingly, basically every place that George visited to share share this practice, was extremely receptive to it, which is, at least to me, a bit shocking. Although it is reported that George was extremely charismatic, persuasive, and passionate about the craft. During his time on the road, George visited small towns in Tennessee, Kentucky, the Carolinas, Virginia, Ohio, and even Indiana, and it's reported that each small town adopted the serpent test of faith with overwhelming popularity after having a demonstration from George himself. And it's because of this that the greater Appalachian region kind of adopted the practice. And I mean, I guess you've kind of got to be a charismatic guy to convince random people you don't know that the best way to worship God is, of course, by handling snakes and drinking venom. From the 1930s to the 1940s and 50s and beyond, churches that went on to adopt this serpent handling ritual became known broadly as churches of God with signs following. And while most of these churches had no real connection besides their Pentecostal roots, the practice of snake handling was able to bring them together and have them categorized as the cult we're discussing right now. Now, if you're asking yourself, where does this belief even come from? And what does it have to do with Christianity at all? Well, the answer is the Bible, actually. People who participate in the serpent handling believe it is so important because of the two following quotes. In Luke 10:19, for example, it says, quote, "Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." Interesting, relatively vague, and I think more metaphorical than anything, but there's also another quote that's a bit more direct, and that's Mark 16:17-18. That goes as follows, quote, "And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils, they shall speak with new tongues, they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." That is a bit more direct, and if you were, laying around in the 1930s and you had a charismatic man show up into your town with snakes and proof from the Bible that handling snakes could make you more godly, or at least prove your godliness, I could see that argument. However, it's definitely not all sunshine and rainbows. And that's because, unsurprisingly and unfortunately, this practice did lead to deaths. Potentially one of the most ironic and notable deaths caused by this practice was the death of George Went Hensley himself, when in July of 1955, he died after receiving a snake bite at a service he was conducting in Florida. Although George passed away because of this tradition, the tradition did not pass away with him. And this practice and larger cult that he was essentially the grandfather of continued to go on for decades and still persists in the modern day. Honestly, I feel like that'd be a really cool video for those, boots on the ground YouTubers that just film videos with people. Like, imagine a video, I spent 24 hours with the snake cult. That would be cool to see, and maybe we'll see it someday. But for now, this is all you got. Now, back to the tragedies. It's been reported that at least 35 people have died between 1936 and 1973 due to the serpent handling practice. And it's also been stated by multiple sources that today there's likely been at least 105 deaths caused by this serpent handling practice associated with the Church of God with signs following. Realistically, the beliefs of this church are going to be the least crazy we talk about because it's honestly just an odd corner of Christianity that, loves snake handling. However, as we've seen, there has definitely been unfortunate tragedies due to this practice. But with that being said, don't touch venomous snakes, and let's move on. Happy science. Admittedly, happy science sounds rather cute and sounds like it could also be part of a kindergarten curriculum. Although, unsurprisingly, the reality of this cult is not cute whatsoever. Happy Science was founded in 1986 in Japan by a man named Ryu Okawa. Ryu was a successful businessman and stock trader who worked internationally. Although as a student and as a working professional, before he even established Happy Science, he knew that he was meant for something more in this life. And he claims this explicitly, stating in one instance, for example, in 1981, 5 years before the establishment of the Happy Science cult, that while working a job, Ryu experienced Buddha enlightenment and came in contact with a divine spirit. This spirit began communicating with him and told him, quote, "Good news, good news." Ryu felt so compelled by this message that he grabbed a pen and paper, wrote it down, and then began asking the spirit that was contacting him, "Who are you?" And Ryu alleges that the spirit was a spirit known as Niku Shonin, a senior disciple from the Buddhist religion. Following that experience in 1981, Ryu made it his mission and destiny to found a new religion. And that he did. And only years later, Happy Science was founded and things got extremely weird. Ryu was a massive believer in the spirit world. And in a 2-year span from 1985 to 1987 alone, he published 13 books in an effort to prove the existence of that spirit world. And interestingly, the final 2 books that he published came out in 1991, and these books titled The Great Warning of Allah and The Terrifying Revelations of Nostradamus were both #1 bestsellers in Japan, which is concerning for reasons we'll get into. You see, on a surface level, Happy Science claims to be a group that is about peace, love, truth-seeking, self-reliance, and ultimate prosperity and happiness. And their goal is to spread happiness and peace by spreading the word and truth of their religion. But would you be surprised if I told you that the true intentions of Happy Science are much darker, and the beliefs surrounding Happy Science are, well, downright delusional? The core belief of Happy Science is that an ancient deity named El Cantare, who is claimed to be the highest god on Earth and the lord of all gods, was originally the ruler of Venus, but came to Earth to establish the human race. And over the course of all of human history, El Cantare has been watching over humanity and has even been reincarnated multiple times to ensure humanity's prosperity. And the most recent incarnation of the highest god of all gods and this ancient spirit from Venus is, of course, well, Ryu Okawa himself, which is why, of course, he's leading Happy Science, because he is the true enlightened one. And he is so enlightened, in fact, that he claims that he speaks to nearly every single god on a daily basis. Not only can he communicate with gods, but he can also communicate with the spirits of dead historical figures. And there's actually a hilarious interview clip of Okawa doing an interview where he is allegedly possessed by the spirit of Margaret Thatcher and speaking from her spirit. Like, just watch this. This is hilarious.
I can't.
Oh.
I'm still alive.
Your ex-Prime Minister,
Prime Minister.
Margaret Thatcher?
I've been Prime Minister. Dennis!
Besides that core belief of the, well, ancient deity from Venus creating all humanity and now being Okawa himself, they also believed in the existence of reincarnation, angels, demons, heaven, hell, and, of course, aliens. And while this cult has extremely kooky roots, from its establishment in 1986 to its #1 bestseller books in 1991, the cult was able to grow to over 5.6 million members worldwide. In 1991 is where things really took off, because the Japanese government officially recognized Happy Science as a religion, giving it a lot more validity. And due to this national recognition, Happy Science took its marketing to the next level, not only releasing ad campaigns, but also creating its own anime to spread its message. But on top of creating animes and running marketing campaigns, Okawa did not stop writing books. And it's believed that today there have been thousands of books written by Okawa, most of which being just transcriptions from his long, drawn-out, well, speeches. And with the combination of all this media being pumped out and the unlikely success of some of this media, Happy Science was gaining a lot of cash flow, allowing them to, of course, further expand their message. And this expansion eventually led to the establishment of their own political party in Japan. That's right, Happy Science was not happy enough being a cult, they also had to create their own political party, known as the Happiness Realization Party. Now, while Happy Science was kind of able to hide under the guise of being a spiritual awakening and a general positivity and happiness and love-sharing group, the political party is really where the cracks started to show. From its establishment on May 23rd, 2009, the HRP, or Happiness Realization Party, expressed some of the following beliefs or policies. The party believed that a nuclear deterrent was absolutely necessary for Japan. They believed that the Nanking Massacre never happened and that Japan never committed any atrocities against China or Korea. The party believed that Japan invading China and Korea could be possible good ideas, and at the very least, they should extremely militarize Japan. And they also had a laser focus on doubling the population of Japan, bringing it to 300 million in the course of only a few decades. These are really only a few tame examples of what the Happiness Realization Party wanted to accomplish with political power. And it really does serve as a stark contrast between the messages of the cult versus the messages of the political party. Because, as I stated, the cult, or religion, claimed to be all about inclusivity and love and happiness and literally saving the world through enlightening people to happiness and love and realizing your inner peace. Or, something like that. That's essentially what they claimed. If you ignore all of the, ancient deity from Venus starting humanity stuff. Regardless, unsurprisingly, this political party was not nearly as popular as Ryu would have wanted. They gained no seats in parliament, and I think largely they were rather obscure and seen as more of a laughingstock. Now, interestingly, both the cult and political party exist to this very day, although in recent years they have been, well, heavily discredited by inside members, specifically the son of Ryu Okawa and the wife of Ryu Okawa, who have both disowned the cult, saying there is not nearly as many members as as they are claimed, and basically disowning their father and husband, saying he was crazy, and this entire cult is, well, a crazy cult. But believe it or not, even with all this lunacy, they still had a literal university that they established in Japan that still exists to this very day. And I guess, speaking of this very day, as of the date of recording this video, Happy Science and the Happiness Realization Party are both still active. But interestingly, they are no longer run by Ryu Okawa, simply because he had passed away. On March 2nd, 2023, the reincarnation of a spirit from Venus had passed away, and since then, the management of both Happy Science and the Happiness Realization Party has kind of been a mystery, because while they remain active, there doesn't appear to be any clear, or at least expressed, change of leadership, and we very well could be actively watching the downfall of this crazy religion that, in my opinion, got way more success and notoriety than it probably ever should have. From ancient deities to anime to millions of dollars to thousands of books to far-right extremism, Happy Science kind of has it all. And I truly hope that this small, oversimplified section has given you a small glimpse into the sheer depravity of, well, that religion turned political party. And with that, let's move on. Grace Road. In the last section, we discussed what happens when you mix insane religious ideologies and extreme political policies. But in this section, we're going to discuss what happens when you mix insane religious ideologies, extreme political policies, and fresh produce. I'm not even joking. Grace Road was established in South Korea in 2002 by a woman named Ok Shin. Ok Shin formed the Grace Road Church because she believed that a doomsday event was on the immediate horizon, and it was her duty to do something about it and to begin informing people, so she and her select chosen few could not only save themselves during this doomsday event, but also save as much of the world as they could. Or at least, so they said. Like basically every cult that's ever existed, its origins and beliefs start with fear-mongering, world-ending, doomsday events that require immediate attention from basically anybody they can get their hands on. And while doomsday events can be scary and compelling, so far we've seen that, well, they've never really happened. That being said, that fact does not stop Grace Road from growing within South Korea. And from 2002 until 2014, Ok Shin's teaching of a world-ending event and doomsday event coming soon was at least convincing enough for 400 people to join the cult. Now, as I stated, a big part of the belief of this, well, church was the fact that they were going to survive this doomsday event and any famine, and one of their plans of doing so was by creating one of the best farms the world has ever seen. And it's even stated on the Grace Road website that, quote, a missionary for the church was sent around the world to discover a land to survive the famine. And after scouring 60 countries, we settled on Fiji. And it's actually the move that Grace Road took from South Korea to Fiji that is truly a turning point in the story. Because in the early years of this cult in South Korea, they were essentially doing planning, gathering resources, ideas, spreading the message, and getting people. But once they found the right country and had enough people, the execution of this plan was truly evil. And interestingly, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, even though there is literally verifiable, provable video evidence of human rights violations taking place at the hands of the Grace Road cult, they are still operating in Fiji to this day and have some of the most successful businesses stimulating the economy of Fiji, which is why this story gets so insane and genuinely complex. The primary goal of Grace Road moving to Fiji was not to coexist and stimulate the economy. It was a meticulously planned hostile takeover that has been extremely effective. And this is a hostile takeover of both Fijian land, job, and natives, but also of the lives of the members of Grace Road, because it is alleged that as soon as all of the members moved from South Korea to Fiji, all of them had their passports seized to ensure they had nowhere to go. And once these members were essentially stuck on this island, things only got worse and worse. Interestingly, Grace Road didn't enter Fiji as a church. They entered as a business, and the first establishment was Grace Farm. And this farm was the first of many businesses to be established by Grace Road as part of this hostile takeover I mentioned previously. Shortly after the establishment of this farm in 2014, Grace Road established 7 different restaurants in the following year in 2015, ranging from grocery stores, noodle stores, pizza stores, dessert cafes, chicken grills, and beyond just growing produce and selling food to locals, they also established their own construction company on island. And Grace Road was quickly becoming vertically integrated on this island. And while on the outside this would seem like a great foreign investment stimulating the local economy, on the inside it was becoming very obvious that this hostile takeover was not only malicious but devious for both the members of the cult and the locals, who unfortunately didn't know it yet. Now, interestingly, during the same time that Grace Road was becoming established within Fiji, Fiji was more or less under a military dictatorship that was extremely oppressive, or at least that's how it's been described by the people who lived through it. And it was because of this extremely strict and violent government that freedom of speech was extremely suppressed, and any negative talk about Grace Road was quickly shut down, along with any negative talk about the current government in Fiji as well. Unsurprisingly, this oppressive cult and this oppressive government quickly got rather tight with each other, and formed essentially a synergistic relationship. The government of Fiji would invest money into the Grace Road businesses, Grace Road would build businesses that the government of Fiji wanted to see on island, the businesses were succeeding, and ultimately the government was able to see the businesses they couldn't make be formed. And the cult was essentially able to have immunity from the government because of the economic impact they were creating. Now, at this point, you're definitely asking yourself, okay, what were they doing? You've been hinting at it. What's going on behind doors? What exactly was this cult doing? And while the doomsday beliefs of this cult are nothing new, it's the actions that this cult was taking that make it so diabolical. As I mentioned earlier, almost as soon as they landed on island, they took the passports from everybody, essentially securing free labor for years to come. And that's because many members of Grace Road, and later on locals as well, were forced into labor at the consistent threat of physical punishment and torture. And it was quickly becoming obvious to the members who went to Fiji that the Grace Road cult was not necessarily about saving the world or themselves at all. Grace Road was more so about securing cheap labor and trafficking people from their home countries to Fiji to ensure that their greater plan of, well, overthrowing Fiji and making it their own home base possible. Interestingly, violence wasn't something that you were just threatened with in this cult. It was a core attribute. And this was proven in 2018 when footage emerged of members of this cult forcibly slapping each other in an attempt to, quote, beat the devil out of each other. And it was shown that in a documentary that aired in South Korea, many ex-members of this cult detailed disgusting allegations of physical abuse, being overworked, not being paid for work, being imprisoned, detained, beaten, and basically being sold the dream of salvation while living the reality of somebody in a Russian labor camp. Fortunately, the reign of terror created by Grace Road did not continue for very long, as the political climate in Fiji changed and stories got out about what was truly going on behind the scenes and the abuse that was taking place. And because of this, investigations were swiftly enacted in Fiji and in South Korea. Unsurprisingly, these investigations led to the arrest of Ok Shin and other high-ranking members of the cult. Although the cult is still active to this day and all of these businesses are still operating. Interestingly, in the businesses in Fiji, you can still get pamphlets that are written from Ok Shin from jail. And these pamphlets only further prove that this woman is willing to stop at nothing to complete her goal. At this point, you almost have to question, is this woman truly just trying to prepare herself and her followers to survive a doomsday event and live in bliss? Or is this woman just a massive grifter using religious fear and physical violence as a means to traffic and control people in an attempt to grow a massive corporate empire to gain leverage and eventual control of small countries and larger countries until she can, well, eventually run the world? But yeah, if you happen to be a tourist in Fiji, you might notice a lot of Grace Road restaurants and grocery stores and dentistry offices and hardware stores, and you might think that, wow, this is just a really cool local chain. But in reality, the entire lore of Grace Road and the cult behind it is just so hard to wrap your head around. And fortunately, right now, justice is starting to be served, although there are still many very real victims of this cult that took pride in the violence it instilled on its members and almost treated physical violence as a certain virtue. This has to be one of the most notable examples of a cult almost successfully taking over a country, and to this day, Grace Road owned businesses are still highly crucial to the economy and, well, livelihood of people in Fiji, making the story that much more complex and truly unfortunate. And what else is unfortunate is the fact that there are so many cults that are still active to this very day. And it was for that reason that it was kind of tough to boil down so many options into one single video. But here's the deal. I love to make videos that you guys want to see. And so if you would like me to cover more cults that are still active today, all you need to do is let me know. Either leave a like or leave a comment below saying part 2, and I'll be sure to get working on that. And I guess if you're part of the 75% of watchers that are currently not subscribed, consider subscribing so you do not miss that part 2. And with that being said, let's get to the final cult on this list: Superior Universal Alignment. Up until this point, the depravity of the cults we've discussed has ranged pretty drastically. However, this last entry is definitely the most disturbing by far, and it's also the most obscure, with a lot of information being pretty tough to find, at least in English. From 1989 to 1993, a mysterious trend started popping up in rural Brazil of young boys going missing only to later be found dead and mutilated, specifically being castrated. And it was with these discoveries that authorities originally thought there was an organ trafficking ring taking place in this small town in Brazil. But what the authorities didn't know is that they weren't dealing with organ traffickers whatsoever. What they were dealing with was an insane cult. The Superior Universal Alignment was born in rural Brazil, allegedly by a woman named Valentina de Andrade, and she, like others on this list, claimed to have received messages from extraterrestrials. But the messages she received from these extraterrestrials were not about love or peace, they were about a doomsday event. But not only was she enlightened to a doomsday event, but she was also enlightened on how she could survive. Although disgustingly, this revelation and the doctrine that, well, spawned from it was truly evil. The doctrine that the Superior Universal Alignment followed was that boys born after 1981 were evil or tainted. And because of this, they needed to be purged from the earth. And it was because of this that Valentina began using her cult members essentially as hitmen to begin murdering young boys. And because of this, as many as 19 boys were victimized, all between the ages of 8 to 13, all with the sole goal of essentially sacrificing these innocent children to an extraterrestrial god to ensure that Valentina and her followers would be seen as true believers and saved by these aliens when the end times would come, which were allegedly very soon. Now, for a bit of context, it's important to mention that the reason that Valentina even had hitmen at the ready was because after this extraterrestrial premonition she had in her mind, she began preaching about the end times locally, and somehow she caught the attention of notable players within her community, specifically businessmen and doctors. And it was with the influence of these businessmen and the skill of these doctors that she was able to carry out some of the most evil acts in the name of, well, cult sacrifice. Personally, I don't understand how you can have a random woman tell you that, hey, yeah, the world's gonna end like in 10 years and we have to kill children in order to have aliens take us on their spaceship to save us. But literally, people fell for that and they began not only following her, but acting out this evil plan on her behalf. Interestingly, it's reported that Valentina claimed that the world was supposed to end in 1989. And when that didn't happen, some people left the cult feeling, well, duped. But others didn't leave the cult and actually became stronger members of the cult because Valentina told them that the reason that the world didn't end yet was because there wasn't enough sacrifices yet to satisfy the extraterrestrials. And while a majority of the cult left in 1989, those who stayed became extremely, well, extreme, which is when the murders truly began to ramp up. Because some of the members in this cult were surprisingly educated doctors, what they would do on this religious killing spree is literally take organs out of the victims they murdered and sell them on the black market in an attempt to continue funding the cult's mission of getting acceptance from aliens. And it was actually the surgical precision of these removed organs that led authorities to these doctors that were linked directly to the Superior Universal Alignment. Although, unfortunately, even with 2 doctors being highly suspected of being involved in these murders, there was not enough evidence to convict them. And they and the rest of the cult were able to continue their reign of terror until 2 boys who were being abducted and actively castrated were able to escape and report to authorities everything that was happening, which led authorities directly to the cult, and the jig, for the most part, was up. And the result of the following investigation was several members of the cult being convicted and sentenced for their crimes. However, interestingly, Valentina, the woman who essentially put all of these people up to this, was reportedly acquitted of her crimes, partly because she was not present at the scene of the crimes when they happened. And with her being acquitted, it's believed by some that there are still remnants of the Superior Universal Alignment being led in rural parts of Brazil by Valentina and potentially others. But unfortunately, I truly don't have any up-to-date information about the court cases or the current state of Superior Universal Alignment. But if nothing else, this cult is just another disgusting example of how people are willing to do almost anything if presented with a charismatic leader and tempted with, well, universal salvation. And to me, it seems scary to believe that some people could truly be tricked to do such disgusting things simply by telling them that, hey, the world's gonna end in a few years, so it doesn't matter anyway. This is for the greater good. And it almost seems like, especially in these last 2 situations, that these cults weren't even religious at all. The religious clothes put on these cults was simply just a red dress to distract the cult members from what was truly going on. A sadistic plan to control or hurt people. And that kind of seems to be the underlying theme with all cults. Somebody has an evil, depraved idea. They use religious ideologies to control people and have them execute those ideas, or be the victim of those ideas. And well, at this point, I don't think I need to tell you that cults are, well, evil. Real-life glitches you experience every day. It was a crisp January morning, and you were waking up at the ass crack of, well, 2 p.m. You see, it's January 1st, New Year's Day, and you spent the night previously getting wasted, and you have a massive hangover. Regardless, you promised yourself that you would make 2026 the best year of your life. No more messing around, no more junk food, no more glitches. All you wanted to do this year was lock in. Although, unfortunately, this year was about to be full of glitches and, well, not locking in whatsoever. Despite your head pounding and stomach feeling upside down, you decide to take a big stretch and get out of bed. But as you reach your arms above your head and bring them back down, you hit your elbow on your headboard and feel an electric shock go from the tip of your finger to the top of your shoulder. You are only seconds into consciously experiencing the new year, and you are already experiencing your first real-life glitch. You see, there are plenty parts of your body that if you bump it, it hurts. But for some reason, there are a few molecules specifically in your elbow that give you one of the most shocking pains that is both terrifying and extremely short-lived. And I know if you're watching this video, then you've definitely hit your funny bone at some point in your life. And statistically speaking, at least a few of you watching have done so today. But to anybody who's ever hit their funny bone, it's rather obvious that A, there's nothing funny about this experience, and B, the sensation you get from hitting your funny bone is unlike any other experience on your body. But yeah, we all kind of know what the funny bone experience is like, but not many of us know how this glitch even happens. And the reason why we have a funny bone is kind of unique. The funny bone is obviously not a bone at all. What's referred to as the funny bone is actually a small stretch of the ulnar nerve, which is closest to the skin in the elbow area. The ulnar nerve runs basically from your neck down to your hand. Now, interestingly, for the most part, the ulnar nerve in your forearm and upper arm is kind of protected by muscle and fat. However, when this nerve passes over your elbow close to the skin, it is at its most vulnerable. And what the ulnar nerve is vulnerable to is being compressed or bumped, both of which obviously can happen when you hit your elbow on something. While it may sound severe to have an electric shock shot through your body, and the fact that you have such a severe reaction to this bump, the reality is that this glitch is extremely normal and common, and like I mentioned, happens to basically everybody. And if you've ever bumped your elbow and thought that you broke something or had permanent nerve damage, then I have good news for you, because actually, that's not the case whatsoever. Hitting your funny bone is not a sign of nerve damage, and in the vast majority of cases is completely harmless, which is a W. And I wish I knew that when I was a paranoid little bro scared that I broke my elbow, when in reality, I just hit the nerve at the wrong point. Now, while this electric shock going through your arm would be enough motivation for most people to finally get out of bed, your hangover is telling you that you could use just a few more minutes. And because you decide to start 2026 like a true grinder and hustle culture bro, you set an alarm for 1 hour and go back to bed. But it wouldn't be long after closing your eyes and slowly fading into sleep that you experience your second glitch of the day. That glitch being the hypnic jerk. Just picture this. I'm sure we've all been there. You're laying in your bed, you're closing your eyes, and you can feel yourself drifting off to sleep. And just as you're in that twilight between wakefulness and unconsciousness, you feel yourself instantly jolt, almost as if you've just fallen or completely lost your balance. This jolt, or jerk, is completely involuntary, and is once again another real-life glitch. Fortunately, similar to hitting your funny bone, the hypnic jerk is not a sign of anything wrong, and is in most cases completely harmless and completely normal. However, that doesn't make it any less scary in the moment, because the shift of state from basically sleeping to the most alert you've ever been is, well, pretty staggering. Regardless, I'm sure we all understand the feeling of the hypnic jerk, and I don't need to explain the experience. But what I do want to explain is exactly why this happens. And the answer is unfortunately not super satisfying, because there is not a definitive answer to this question yet. However, there are leading theories that are logical and likely the case. The leading theory about hypnic jerks as of now is that in this transition between being awake and being asleep, sometimes your body can kind of miscommunicate with itself and interpret signals wrong. And in the case of hypnic jerks, what's happening is as your muscles begin to relax and as your mind and body are transitioning from being awake to sleeping, somewhere in your brain, somebody is hitting the alarm button because part of your brain is interpreting this relaxation of muscles as essentially a loss of control. More specifically, a loss of balance or simply falling altogether. And as a result, for self-defense, your body tries to have you jolt to protect yourself, either to regain your balance or brace for impact on a fall that isn't happening whatsoever. And I'm not sure about you guys, but I have vividly had multiple hypnic jerk experiences where in my dream, I was doing something that led to the jerk, which I don't know how that's even connected. Like, you know how sometimes you're on Instagram Reels and you see a reel where somebody's playing baseball, but the ball just hits the camera and you literally jump? That was basically going on in my dream leading up to the hypnic jerk. However, I'm curious if your body is anticipating a hypnic jerk and for that reason, subconsciously plan something in your dreams. Or do your dreams cause the jerk in some cases? I don't know, but back to our hungover bro. Since you've now involuntarily been subjected to biological shock therapy, you decide that maybe it's time to get up. However, because it's the new year and it's obviously a new you decide to break old habits. And we all know that the best way to break an old habit is by doing it just one more time. And for that reason, you grab your lotion, your tissues, and open up your laptop. And without going into too much detail about what's going on there, we can actually talk about a different type of jerking that's not a hypnic jerk, at least kind of. Have you ever been hanging out with your bros and noticed that some people jork it with their left hand while others do it? Okay, that's a dumb example. Let's do a different example. Have you ever noticed that some people reach for their phone from their bed with their left hand while some do it from their right hand? This phenomenon is known as handedness, and it's actually quite interesting. Unsurprisingly, a majority of the world is right-handed, but hopefully all of us also know that there is a population of the world that is left-handed. And if you were a true scholar, then you probably also know that there is an even smaller percentage of people that are ambidextrous, meaning that they could interchangeably use either hand as their dominant hand. All of these are interesting and not necessarily uncommon, but did you know that at least 2 of these 3 are a glitch? Let me explain. Now, for starters, the reason why I say 2 out of these 3 is because I don't want to directly call out anybody as being glitched, because realistically that's not the case. But the lore behind how you develop your dominant hand is really quite interesting. But I guess if we're being fair, statistically, 90% of people are right-handed, meaning that, of course, 10% of people on average are left-handed, potentially suggesting that being left-handed could be a glitch. But on the same token, potentially everybody who's not ambidextrous is having a glitch because, I mean, we have 2 arms, why aren't they both dominant? Or at the very least, why doesn't everybody have the same dominant arm? These are great questions, and the answer is, well, interesting. Being either left or right-handed is one of the most obvious ways of showcasing a human brain being wired differently. And before people stretch it too far, this wiring differently doesn't necessarily extend to other things. I'm specifically talking about the wiring for your dominant hand. However, there are people that believe that being left or right-handed may come with other related traits, although this isn't necessarily scientific, and there is no inherent superiority between being left or right-handed. Scientists believe that the reason why some people have a different dominant hand is because of a cocktail of different factors, specifically genetic factors, prenatal brain development, and environmental factors. And it's also believed by scientists that because you can observe a child having either a left or right dominant hand at a very young age, it is believed that your dominant hand is not a learned behavior, and that in some cases your brain even picks your dominant hand before you're ever born, as your brain is still, well, developing. But regardless of which arm you use dominantly to grab your tissues or grab anything else, the reality is that this glitch happens in your brain before you're even born, and truly doesn't mean anything. And I think in the modern day, we all understand this. However, in the past, people were extremely superstitious. And if you lived at basically any point in history prior to the last 100 or so years, you would have been judged extremely harshly because you were left-handed, because people perceived this biological glitch to be something more nefarious. And in Roman culture, for example, people were so superstitious that left-handedness was actually associated with being a bad person. And when Christianity became the dominant religion in Europe, this tradition sort of stuck around for a while and took a long time for the stigma to be, well, erased. And while left-handed people are definitely not glitches, they have more or less experienced a glitch in their mom's belly. And for that reason, they've kind of had a rough go of things. More so in the past, but even in the modern day, there are just so many things that are designed and ergonomically optimized for right-handed people. But fortunately, the business of left-handed products has boomed, and, well, here we are today. After completing your solo session of morning glory, you finally put your feet on the floor and get your booty out of bed, officially starting your new year, hoping that you're done experiencing any more glitches. As you stand up and shuffle around your room, you feel that your room is feeling stuffy, so you walk over to your window, open it up, and take a deep breath of that fresh, crisp January winter air. But instead of experiencing a blissful inhale of crisp air, you instead feel like you have just been stabbed in the lung. Obviously, any shooting or stabbing pain in your chest is an immediate, obvious sign of a medical emergency. However, in this case, it's actually not. Although this pain in your chest is extremely uncomfortable and is definitely scary the first time you experience it, it's not a medical emergency, and it's actually another real-life glitch. Interestingly, at least for me personally, when this first happened to me, even though I felt like something was wrong, I was too scared to tell my mom about it because it happened when I was a kid, and I just hoped it would go away on its own. And it did, and I kind of forgot about it. But every time this would happen every few months or so, I had that same fear, and I never bothered to Google it or tell anybody about it. I just, as a child, accepted my death, assuming I had a ruptured lung and I was just simply waiting to perish. But instead, I got over it and then started playing Minecraft again. If this sounds even remotely familiar to you, let me explain what's actually happening when you're experiencing this very intense but typically short-lived chest pain. According to doctors, at least in young people, the primary cause for this sudden and sharp chest pain is something known as precordial catch syndrome. And similar to hitting your funny bone, the precordial catch syndrome is literally caused, once again, by a pinched nerve. Interestingly, the whole glitch of this chest pain known as precordial catch syndrome has absolutely nothing to do with your lungs or heart at all. At least for me, every time I experienced this pain, I thought my lung was punctured or being ruptured in some way. However, that's not the case at all, and it's only a nerve that's passing through that cavity. This glitch or syndrome is actually typically caused most commonly by sitting with poor posture, or directly after changing your seating position, which makes it kind of even more shocking because if you're just sitting down, that's kind of the last time you expect to have a random shooting pain. But when it comes to precordial kedge syndrome, it can happen to you at any time. And in your case, simply opening the window and looking out of it and taking a deep inhale was enough to trigger it. And now that deep inhale is extremely painful. But luckily for you, it's at least harmless and will pass in minutes. I don't know about you guys, but when I'm experiencing this lung glitch, even though it has nothing to do with your lung, the last thing I want to do is take a deep breath. And I'll typically just take shallow breaths until it passes. However, some doctors do recommend taking one very deep breath, as that is known to sometimes end the pain immediately. So I guess it's kind of up to you if you want to wait a few minutes till it pass naturally, or if you want to endure the pain and get rid of it instantly. Either way, there's absolutely no risks to your health, which I think is comforting, especially for many of us who have experienced this and just assumed that we had something wrong with us that we just wanted to, well, ignore. And I just wish I could have told 10-year-old bro that. Or even last week's bro, because honestly, I didn't even know about this until right now researching for this video. But back to you. After you finally let the pain subside, you decide to close your window, leave the bedroom, and enter the kitchen because you want to have a nice breakfast. Although, as soon as both of your feet were planted in the kitchen, well, you've totally forgot what you went in there for. And if this situation sounds familiar to you, then you have also experienced this glitch. And this glitch is actually known as the doorway effect. The doorway effect is a common cognitive glitch where your brain essentially resets or reorganizes its thoughts as you move from one environment to another. It may seem like something small, but walking through a doorway creates enough of a clear boundary within your mind between environments that your brain literally creates this as a transitional shift in context. And because of that, as you go from the old environment to the new environment, your brain sometimes can clear the cache, making you feel clueless once you're in this room, even though you just had what you wanted to do on your mind. This glitch in some cases can be scary because you literally feel like you have early onset dementia, but it's just your brain trying to reduce some of the background noise so it can focus on this new environment, even though you just went from your bedroom to your kitchen. It should go without saying that this glitch is actually harmless, and believe it or not, it's not a sign of low intelligence or a poor working memory whatsoever. This effect is actually a reflection of how your brain organizes experiences into segments based on your environment. And as I mentioned earlier, if your brain is effective at removing cognitive clutter, the thought you had in the old environment, then in some situations, it can misfire, remove too much context, and well, you'll be clueless for a second or two, typically. And while this happens to most of us on a semi-regular basis, there are factors that can actually cause this to happen more often, such as general stress or multitasking. But in any context, it's not dangerous, it's not a negative sign, and it only happens because your brain accidentally got rid of too much stuff to try to focus on this new environment. After noticing a spoon on your dining room table, you realized why you walked in the kitchen in the first place. You obviously wanted to have breakfast. And because this was already a glitch-filled day of a year that was supposed to be glitch-free, you decide to have the breakfast of champions, Cheerios with beer, because your hangover was not going to treat itself. But as you walk over to the pantry and open it, you realize one fatal mistake. The Cheerios that you swore were in the pantry were nowhere to be found. And even though you literally bought them yesterday, no matter where you look, it seems like they have almost vanished. Getting irritated, you call your mom into the kitchen, asking if she saw them or moved them, and without even saying anything to you, it seems like your mom reached into the pantry and pulled the Cheerios out of thin air. And embarrassingly, you realize that the Cheerios were right in front of you the whole time. They just weren't exactly where you expected them to be. If you've ever been searching for something only to realize that it was literally right in front of you the whole time and you were just somehow ignoring it, then, well, you've also experienced this real-life glitch. Similar to the doorway effect, not being able to see something directly in your plain sight of view has nothing to do with memory failure or anything of the sort. This glitch is once again a mechanism of your brain trying to get rid of low priority or irrelevant information. And sometimes, well, it gets rid of the wrong stuff. One example of this mechanism working properly is the fact that you literally can't notice your nose. Like your brain intentionally ignores your nose, although you can totally see it. And if you don't believe me, put your finger on the tip of your nose and look down at it. For a few moments afterwards, you will be hyper aware of your nose, at least in most cases. But as we've seen in other cases, you can literally ignore exactly what you're looking for. And once again, stress and multitasking can help amplify this, well, glitch. Another similar but less visual example of not seeing something in plain sight is, well, looking for your phone when it's literally in your hand, or looking for your car keys when they're literally in your ignition. Regardless, after your mom seemingly magically pulled cereal out of thin air, you enjoy a quick bowl of Cheerios and quickly head out of the house because your mom asked you to grab something from the store. As you close the door and begin to walk towards your car, you get in, start the car, and begin driving, only to instantly have the thought, did I lock the front door? And did I turn off the sink after cleaning my bowl? These are two examples of simple questions we likely ask ourselves every day. but believe it or not, they're actually also a mental glitch. I'm gonna keep this one brief as it works on similar mechanisms of the last two, but the reason why so many people are so unsure if they've done basic tasks like locking a door or turning something off is actually the fact that it's a low thought or low attention task. Most of us habitually turn off what we need to turn off and lock what we need to lock. And for that reason, we don't pay much attention to do it. We do it subconsciously. But here's the thing. Our memories are strongly tied to our attention, meaning that if our focus is weak on something, at least consciously, our memories will be weak too. Which is why, more often than not, if we do a task habitually, we will likely have little to no memory of it, creating doubt in our mind, potentially causing us to double check or have anxiety until we come back home to check. However, in most cases, we did do the thing, we just didn't remember. And once again, this is just our brain's attempt to have less cache in the background so we can have more mental bandwidth to focus on what matters. You know, the saber-toothed tiger in front of us, not the locked door in our past. And in some severe cases, this glitch could actually lead you to cause your child at home when you go on a family vacation. But luckily enough, this will actually be the premise of one of the best Christmas movies of all time. After retracing your steps in your mind, you come to the conclusion that you definitely did lock the door, and your anxiety reduces at least a little bit. And because you feel like you've been battling yourself for hours now, you decide to check the time, because you know the drive to the grocery store is 20 minutes, and you have to be at least halfway there. But as you look at the clock on your dashboard, you notice that you've only been driving for 2 minutes. And at this point, it feels, well, impossible. And while the only explanation at this point may seem like a time warp, in reality, you are experiencing, well, you guessed it, another glitch. This glitch being time dilation. And while this phenomenon is something most of us experience on a daily basis, I would argue most of us don't actually know how it works. There's a popular saying that goes, time flies when you're having fun. And honestly, that's kind of scientifically true. But also, the opposite is true. Time goes very slow when you're scared, and you just experienced that on your drive. Because of the anxiety of not remembering if you locked your door, your brain had to process more information per second than it would on average because you were trying to retrace your steps and try to remember exactly if you moved the knob or not. And because even though you were simply just driving down the road, due to the fact that you were so deep in thought thinking about locking the door or not, and the additional information you had to process to do so, your mind was creating denser memories, and for that reason, as you look back on that 2-minute drive you had, it feels like it was longer than it actually was. And that's because your brain indirectly measures time through attention, memory, and sensory input. Now, interestingly, on the contrast, when you are doing repetitive or enjoyable tasks that don't require a ton of thought, your mind is able to relax, and for that reason, time seems like it's simply flying by. But that's because you're not necessarily forming as many memories, and your perception of that time passed is, well, less. And this mechanism is extremely similar to why you forget if that door was even locked in the first place. And once again, this glitch is not a flaw or a sign of anything negative, it's simply a byproduct of your brain trying to be as efficient as possible. And sometimes it doesn't always get it right. And I guess the negative byproduct of this byproduct is that fun times seem to be really short and bad times seem to be really long. But in reality, they're just both your brain's perspective of them. After a long, seemingly endless drive, you arrive at the grocery store, but as soon as you walk through the doors, you notice something horrible brewing. Deep within your diaphragm, you notice a spasm happening, and before you can even process what's going on, you make that terrible sound. You have just got the hiccups out of nowhere. And once again, you have been cursed with another real-life glitch. And as I would bet money that everybody watching this video has experienced hiccups, I doubt most of us understand the true reason why we experience such a seemingly random, well, reflex. Unsurprisingly, hiccups are harmless. I think we all know that by now. But what not everybody knows is the reason why they happen. And hiccups are actually caused by the diaphragm, which is the primary muscle responsible for breathing. What's happening when you hiccup is that your diaphragm is unexpectedly spasming. And with each spasm of the diaphragm is a quick intake of air. Now, this intake of air is short-lived and is actually abruptly cut off by your vocal cords snapping shut, which is what creates that classic hiccup sound. But besides how hiccuping even works, the reason we get hiccups is because of, well, a pretty big handful of factors. Hiccups can be triggered by either eating too quickly, swallowing air, drinking a carbonated beverage, a sudden change in temperature in your environment, emotional stress, or excitement. And the single common denominator amongst most of those triggers is that the nerves involved with breathing, specifically the phrenic and vagus nerves, become irritated, overstimulated, and for that reason, essentially set off the hiccup reflex. And this reflex can go on for minutes, hours, or in some cases, even days, and even more extreme cases, weeks. If nothing else in this video, we've learned that nerves are responsible for a lot of glitches. But it's interesting how much they just glitch and begin working against us. Because while they are harmless, they're definitely annoying, and in some cases embarrassing. And because your hiccups were just so severe in this grocery store, you decide that whatever your mom needed, it could wait until later. So you decide to get back in your car, drive home, and step into the kitchen. Luckily, your hiccups went away on your drive home. However, as soon as you step into the kitchen, you are hit with an overwhelming feeling that what you are doing right now, you've done before. Everything was the same. The clothes you're wearing, the time of day, the location you're standing was all overwhelmingly familiar. And while this feeling hits you in such a strong way, it's not scary, it's just odd. And it's also a glitch commonly known as deja vu. One good example of deja vu for people that watch the channel a lot is me telling you that 75% of you watching this video right now are not subscribed, at least according to YouTube. And also, I love making videos that you guys really enjoy. So if you love this video about real life glitches and want to see another one, make sure to leave a like or leave a comment below saying part 2 so I know that you guys want another episode in this series. Now, shilling aside, deja vu is likely one of the most common mental glitches we've all experienced, probably on a semi-regular basis. For me, deja vu is pretty rare, but probably happens at least maybe once a year. Although almost every time I experience it, it's equally unsettling, but also rather short-lived. It's almost like a wave that hits you and then just splashes away and fades back into the ocean. Although for me, the lingering feeling after deja vu is definitely eerie. And what else is eerie about this glitch is the fact that there's no definitive reasoning for deja vu, at least as of yet. The leading explanation for deja vu right now is that deja vu happens when the brain processes the same information in two slightly different ways. And if that sounds confusing, well, just imagine information floating through your brain. But instead of information going through two different pathways at the same speed, information in pathway 1 is just slightly faster than information in pathway 2. As information from pathway 1 reaches the final destination faster than 2, by the time that the second information gets there as well, it perceives that second part of information not as complementary to the first, but as a recollection, if that makes sense. It's an interesting theory, but it's also not the only one. Another more simple theory for why deja vu happens is that our brain is literally just glitching out and swapping out the emotions for familiarity with recollection. And based off what we've learned about the brain so far in this video, that seems plausible. But because you've just had an awful day so far, you've been hungover all day, you've been experiencing endless glitches, and your head is pounding, you decide that your best bet now is to go to bed, catch a nap, rest, recover, hopefully sleep everything off, and end this endless streak of glitches, hopefully for this entire year. As you get as snug as a bug in a rug and begin to once again drift off into dreamland, you fortunately avoid the hypnic jerk and successfully fall into sleep. Although it wouldn't be long until you experience the final glitch of the day. As you lay in your bed, you feel a looming presence looking over you, and you so happen to half asleep, half awake open your eyes, only to notice the most terrifying shadow figure in the corner of your room. Being absolutely petrified, the only thing you want to do is hide and scream and run, but unfortunately, you can do nothing of the above. Your mouth won't open, your arms won't move, and this creature is only moving closer and closer to you. Your body is absolutely paralyzed, and your mind is only half on your side. And this glitch is likely the most terrifying we've discussed in this entire list. That glitch being sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is only typically something that people experience for seconds to minutes tops, but that doesn't make it any less terrifying in the moment. The reason why sleep paralysis happens is because during REM sleep, your brain automatically shuts off your muscles so you don't act out on your dream, which is the reason why we're not all sleepwalkers all the time. But that's another glitch we can talk about in a part 2, sleepwalking. However, sometimes when your brain turns off your muscles, it can also forget to turn itself off, which leads to sleep paralysis. The state where your brain is either half or still fully awake, but your muscles are, well, paralyzed, leaving you in a very awkward and scary situation. Although, fortunately, it's not dangerous, or a sign of any mental illness or demonic possession. Sleep paralysis is more likely to occur if you've experienced sleep deprivation, irregular sleep schedules, high stress, or, interestingly, sleeping on your back. But in every case of sleep paralysis, your body will figure itself out, albeit with a bit of discomfort to your psyche, especially if you're experiencing, well, shadowy hallucinations. Luckily for you, as this shadow demon crawled onto your bed, it noticed your extremely crispy and crunchy bed sheets and decided that you were the real demon here, and it disappeared. And as that fog lifted and your fear was gone, you were able to truly go to bed and end this very glitchful day, hoping that the next day would be better. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that'll conclude our first ever video about real life glitches, common habits that are signs of high intelligence. Late night insight. It's 10 p.m. on a school night. You've done all your homework, maybe you've done all your work. You've played video games with your friends, you've done everything you could possibly do in the day, and for some reason, you still don't feel like going to bed. It's completely reasonable to be going to bed at this time, and honestly, it would save you a lot of headache in the morning. Although, for some reason, you decide to opt out of sleeping and stay up a few more hours just to enjoy a little bit of late night solitude. On a surface level, this may seem like an irresponsible decision, primarily being motivated by a lack of discipline or potentially a lack of respect for sleep. However, in some cases, that's truly not the case. And what this odd late-night choice actually represents is something you might not expect. Now, I would say that most people watching this video would probably associate waking up early and starting your day with a strong routine, or at least at an early hour, would represent high intelligence, because you are taking initiative in starting your day early, signaling proactivity and, of course, intention. Although, according to recent studies, that's actually not the case, and at least when it comes to brain function, opting to stay up late has been strongly correlated with higher intelligence. And I'm not just making this up to make myself feel better, because it might not be a surprise that being a YouTuber, my sleep schedule is not necessarily ideal. According to numerous scientific studies that have been conducted, people that are more likely to stay up late rather than wake up early show more of a specific type of intelligence that has been linked to prestigious jobs and higher incomes. Which is definitely an interesting metric, although money doesn't necessarily equate to intelligence per se. But of course, that isn't the only study. I just thought it was interesting. The University of Madrid, for example, did an in-house study on nearly 1,000 teenagers. And the sole goal of the study was to determine the sleep patterns of these students and then correlate that sleep pattern with their test results. Out of those nearly 1,000 students, 25% of them classified themselves as a morning person, and 32% of them classified themselves as a night owl. Oh, and the other roughly 50% didn't feel like they qualified in either of the groups, so they were just kind of neutral sleepers. Regardless, once they had the sleep patterns of every one of these participants, they then went on to track their academic output. And how this was tracked was the university would monitor the final grades for each of these students in major subjects. Math, science, writing, stuff like that. Unsurprisingly, the results of this study showed that participants that stayed up later or were night owls scored higher than morning types across the board, specifically on inductive reasoning. Now, inductive reasoning is an interesting metric to note because it has been shown to be one of the best estimates of general intelligence, and it is also one of the strongest predictors of academic performance. That, to me, is super interesting, and honestly makes a lot of sense, because I feel like if you try to compare it apples to apples and just say, oh, well, people that stay up late are better at math than people that wake up early, it doesn't really paint the full picture. Being gifted in math really only demonstrates one sort of intelligence, while inductive reasoning kind of covers general intelligence, which could apply to any subject. So for that reason, I think inductive reasoning is a smart variable, although it's also something I've never heard before, so I guess we're all learning today. But of course, these weren't the only studies to suggest that people that stayed up late were potentially more intelligent, or at least had better inductive thinking skills. The US Air Force, for example, did a study on their recruits, and what they found was that their night owl recruits were significantly more able to think laterally than their early bird recruits, even in morning meetings, which kind of just adds insult to injury because morning time is literally the natural habitat of early risers. Interestingly, throughout all of the studies that have been taking place on people that wake up early versus staying up late, there has been one commonality that has been associated with both sleepers, that being personality types. It has been suggested by Professor Jim Horn of Loughborough University that people that stay up late are more likely to be extroverted creative types, typically artists or inventors. And morning people, for example, are more likely to be logical and are often seen in logical jobs like accounting. Now, while all of this information is interesting and at least personally affirming, it's also not an end-all be-all. There is no right sleep routine besides the one that feels most natural to you and fits your lifestyle most. And just because you wake up early, it doesn't mean you're any less smart than somebody who stays up late. Specifically because you could be night owl brained, but your job simply doesn't allow for that. Although, if you do find yourself typically tending to stay up late at night, that just might be a sign that you have high intelligence. Or insomnia, and in that case, I would see a doctor. Teddy bear intellect. Have you ever given your car a nickname, felt bad for knocking over a stuffed animal, or maybe just had a strong emotional attachment to any inanimate object? Well, you might be smarter than you think, at least in a certain capacity. I would argue that there's likely two groups of people watching this video right now. One group of people that have at least a few core items from their childhood that they refuse to ever give up. A blanket, a stuffed animal, or something of the sort. While the other group had absolutely no issue destroying every shred of their childhood as soon as they hit puberty. Neither of these approaches to life are necessarily wrong, although they do signal different things. In the first example I gave, having a strong emotional connection to items you grew up with, this connection to inanimate objects has actually been associated with elevated emotional intelligence. And in some cases, this emotional connection with this object is considered to be anthropomorphism, which is essentially when you project either human emotions or attributes onto an object or animal. And there is a lot of famous examples of anthropomorphism in pop culture. For example, the movie Cars, or Lion King, or literally any movie where there is a character that is non-human but has human traits. This anthropomorphic trend in media is not necessarily by mistake either, and that's because anthropomorphism is typically associated with people that have high levels of empathy and also high levels of creativity, making it no surprise that the people that are giving you a movie about, well, talking cars are also some of the most talented animators and storytellers working in creative professions. Now, in my opinion, this sort of elevated emotional empathy and intelligence, while awesome, does come with its own downsides, specifically making a lot of things in life harder. When you find yourself gaining some sort of attachment to almost every object in your life, it makes moving on or downsizing a lot more complicated. And as we've seen, extreme versions of this mindset actually lead to some pretty horrendous situations. You know, the type of stuff you see on TLC. For example, the show Hoarders is all about people who are so attached to objects, and in a lot of cases, hoarding becomes dangerous, if not downright deadly. And it's believed in those extreme cases such as hoarding that these people are suffering from long-term mental trauma, and they're trying to use objects to fill a void that they have emotionally in their heart, which is very unfortunate. Another different extreme that I would have to assume operates on the same mental function would be that one guy that would like kiss and, have fun with his car. He had more than an emotional relationship with that vehicle, and I would have to assume that the part of his brain that is, well, responsible for separating the line between people and objects was completely blurred, leaving him in a sexual relationship with a vehicle. So yeah, if you ever find yourself feeling extra sentimental about a trinket, a toy, or something of the sort, and either you can't live without it or you get very upset if you lose something that, well, seemed meaningless, you're not a baby and you're not broken. You are more likely just sensitive and have a higher emotional intelligence. Your brain has a strong capacity for memory, and it applies these strong memories and emotional meanings with different things. And most of the time, the meaning of this object has nothing to do with the object itself. For example, let's say your grandfather passed away and he left you a fishing rod. This fishing rod might have so much meaning to you and you could never live without it. Now, from a functional perspective, you may have never fished in your life and you don't like fishing and you never will fish. That doesn't affect the way you feel about this rod because you've associated memories and emotions to it, making it something you now have an attachment to. And that's okay. And it's also not a form of materialism. It's a form of your brain trying to express how it feels in a way that is tangible to, well, you. So yeah, it's okay to have an emotional connection to your items, and it's also okay not to. If you're the type of person who has no sentimental bone in your body and you could throw away anything in an instant, that is also in a way a superpower because you are not weighed down by any of the things that these extra sensitive people are. And as I want to make clear once again, there is no right or wrong. There are simply different people with different brains. And in the case of sentimentality, it has been shown that people that find themselves closely attached to objects often have a higher emotional intelligence, and that is pretty interesting. Fiction intuition. Have you ever been reading your favorite fictional fairy tale or potentially your favorite romantic novel, only to be told by somebody rudely implying that reading fiction is a waste of time because it's not real and therefore not educational? If you have, I feel your pain. And fortunately, I've got some good news for you. Recent studies suggest that reading fiction isn't only not a waste of time, it's actually a sign of, you guessed it, high intelligence. And before we get into that, I want to quickly note too that reading in general is probably a good indicator of intelligence. And it's something that most of us probably don't do enough. At least I know I don't. And I guess that's more of a 2026 problem, not enough people are reading, but I do believe that holding a physical book and reading is good for your mind and probably a sign of intelligence. Regardless, the reason why fiction is so strongly associated with a high intelligence is because what fiction demands. Unlike reading non-fiction books, fiction requires the reader to imagine scenes, interpret emotions, follow detailed plot points, and even understand characters' motives and intentions. While reading a detailed fictional story, the brain is consistently trying to predict outcomes, connect past events, and make sense of subtle clues hidden within the dialogue. The habit of reading this and seeking out this sort of material proves that your brain is not only able to handle it, but thrives off of it. And interestingly, it's been shown that reading fiction books strengthens reading comprehension, memory, abstract thinking, and is thought to generally improve your higher cognitive ability. Meaning that not only is reading fiction a habit of somebody with high intelligence, but it is literally a habit that could also increase your intelligence as well, making it something that literally everybody can benefit from, which is really cool. Now, it might sound counterintuitive to suggest that reading books in your room alone can increase your social skills, but some studies have also suggested that that may be the case. And the reason for this is something I've kind of already alluded to. Fiction can increase your emotional intelligence and social skills because as you're reading stories with detailed characters, you are mentally building empathy for their situations, understanding the social dynamics between different characters, and in most cases, developing an ability to understand complex human behaviors by being able to almost see it from a third-person perspective, something that books and media are able to do in a unique way. I mean, you could probably do this in real life as well too, but you have to basically be watching people have conversations and just be eavesdropping a lot to get the same benefit. And even then, you wouldn't get as much context as, well, a book would give you. But on top of just the demanding nature of most fiction novels, as well as the exercise in emotional intelligence, there is also the mental benefit of simply holding your attention on something that is, well, demanding for a long amount of time. Most fiction readers are not reading their book for 5 or 10 minutes. They're long-haul readers, at least the ones that I've met. And these long sessions require patience, imagination, and literal mental endurance. And people who are able to focus for a long amount of time and concentrate on things like plot points, themes, and symbolism, as well as character development, show obvious signs of cognitive strength and stamina, which is kind of amazing. And while some may still make the argument that, well, fiction has no real-world application, the reality is, it really does, just not in a direct way. Sure, a business book can show you how to potentially grow or run a business, but fiction can help expand your mind in a way that will literally allow you to benefit all aspects of your life by having a more finely tuned brain and potentially even better social skills and emotional intelligence. And while your results and strengths may vary, the science is pretty conclusive that reading in general is great, and fiction reading has some pretty unique benefits that I personally was pretty unaware of. And I guess with that, score 1 for the nerds. The messy megamind. Whether it be at school or at work, I'm sure you've come across one of two groups of people in your travels. The first group of people, either at work or school, keeps their desk in immaculate condition. Pencils lined up the right way, at a perfect angle, no shavings on the desk, papers perfectly in order, and the general workspace is as pristine as can be. Now, on the complete opposite side, the other individual has a desk that looks like a nuclear bomb just went off. Papers are seemingly put everywhere, pencils are all over the place. The pencils themselves are more of nubs and shreds than actual pencils, and there truly seems to be no rhyme or reason for anything in this workspace. If I were to ask you, out of these two individuals, which one is likely to have a higher intelligence, what would you say? While the neat desk would likely seem like the obvious choice, I'm sure the now unsurprising answer is the opposite. According to studies, it is a known fact that highly intelligent people typically don't prioritize neatness when it comes to their workplace. Their brains are typically more focused on deeper, more meaningful tasks, and for that reason, cleanliness is usually pushed to the bottom of the totem pole. In a majority of cases, having a slightly messy desk isn't a sign of laziness whatsoever. It's a reflection of having a busy, active mind that places creativity and problem solving above, well, cleanliness and busy work. And the thesis behind the study was that a strict, orderly desk or workspace encourages the person at the desk to think conventionally, within the lines, and make safe, rational decisions, which definitely has a time and place. Although it's also suggested that people with a slightly messy desk are more likely to think out of the box, more unconventionally, and for that reason, more creatively, which also has its own perks and benefits. It's believed that for some people with high IQ, their work is typically done in bursts of passion and deep concentration, meaning that during these literal brain blasts, workspace cleanliness is not even a thought in their mind. And by the time that their task or work session is complete, they typically don't have the mental energy to go ahead and clean their desk. At least, not usually, but everybody's different. And while this may just seem like a cope to some people, there is true validity behind the thought process. It is a historically documented fact that Einstein, for example, had a famously messy desk. And interestingly, he has even gone on record saying, quote, "If a cluttered desk is a sign of a cluttered mind, of what then is an empty desk a sign?" Obviously suggesting that, yes, if your desk is cluttered, your mind is cluttered, you're thinking, you're being active. However, if your desk is empty and clean and prim and proper, maybe your mind is, well, clean, but empty as well. Obviously a bit biased and sarcastic, but I definitely think he has a point with this whole quote. Now, throughout this section, I have been mentioning slightly messy because there is a level between, well, like we've talked about, slightly messy and complete disasters. And there is a major difference between the two. And similar to the whole hoarder example I mentioned earlier, I don't think that you can apply this mindset to a hoarder house and say, wow, that person must be extremely smart because their entire house is a disgusting mess. That's obviously not the case and is a sign of not high intelligence per se, but potentially of mental illness. Regardless, a lot of the studies done on, well, this messiness specifically relates to desks, although I do think this whole theory could be applied to other environments, such as bedrooms, studios, and other potentially creative places. Interestingly, a big reason why a lot of these messy environments stay messy is because to the person who created them, this is controlled chaos. And while to an outsider, your desk full of pencils and papers everywhere makes no sense, to you, you know exactly where everything is. You know that under that second piece of paper there is the perfect pencil you like to write with. And you know that under that stained textbook is, well, the best calculator known to man. And even though it looks like there's just random scraps of paper everywhere, you know that each one of those pieces of paper actually contains important information relevant to something you're working on. And for that reason, if in your eyes your workplace seems to be, well, at least orderly enough for you to know where everything is, why would you clean it if you could already operate functionally? You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And while I would definitely say there's a time and place to organize things and keep a certain level of cleanliness in your life and in your professional workplace, it's definitely interesting to see the scientific correlations between intelligence and, well, messiness in your workplace. But I'm also kind of curious if this entire study was done by scientists that were getting scolded for having a dirty lab. And instead of cleaning or hiring a janitor, they just decided to do a whole study proving that, well, actually, they're so smart they need a raise because their lab is dirty. But what do I know? The sleepy genius. As a child, naps are a normal and crucial part of life. Although, as an adult, naps take on a different role, a more divisive role. For me personally, I am definitely not one for naps, and if I'm up, I'm up. And the only time I sleep is when I am down for the night. Although, it's not lost on me that there is a large group of the population that simply love their beauty sleep, and they will get as much as they possibly can. Even if they can only get 5 minutes on the couch, 2 minutes on the bus, 10 hours in their bed, 30 seconds at their desk, whatever sleep they can get, they will. And while to me the endless sleep-wake cycle sounds pretty horrible, according to science, the habit of taking a midday nap is not only a sign of unemployment, but also of high intelligence. I guess from a bird's eye view, it kind of makes sense, right? Like, as a baby, naps and sleep in general are massive for both body and brain development. Why not try to maximize those benefits as an adult as well? Jokes aside, obviously there is a lot of reasons for napping as an adult. Unique work schedules, illness, sleep disorders, and of course, high intelligence. And in the context of high intelligence, the reason why napping isn't an uncommon hobby is kind of interesting. People with high IQs are consistently processing information, analyzing details, and forming complex ideas, at least in the context of work. And because of this high mental activity causes a lot of cognitive energy drain, making you feel extremely fatigued, typically in not too long of a time, depending on how demanding the work is and your baseline energy. This combination of demanding work and also drained energy can leave you feeling extremely fatigued, even if you haven't done anything particularly physical, which is why some people opt to nap. A brief nap, even a 5 to 10 minute power nap, allows your brain to reorganize information, reset its focus, and recover from heavy mental load. And with unique techniques and specific intentions, you can make a significant amount of progress in your mental bandwidth with only a short amount of time if you know what you're doing. These intentional naps can also almost be categorized as meditation, which kind of has a similar effect. If you are doing work or participating in a situation that requires a heavy mental load, at some point your brain is going to feel fatigued and you are literally going to be, well, mentally burned out. This is something that we've all felt, and some of us carry this feeling for the rest of the day or even the rest of the week, depending on how severe it is. Although it's been shown that intentionally napping or even meditating in some cases during the day can intentionally reset your brain, essentially clearing its cache, freeing up more space to do more thought-provoking work. And I think it's important to note that your brain is a powerhouse and requires a lot of energy. And on a daily basis, your brain typically burns anywhere from 400 to 500 calories per day. And if you're familiar with exercise and fitness, then you know how much energy and output it requires to burn 500 calories. So just applying that to your brain on a daily basis without moving, it's insane to think about how much work your brain is doing on, well, the inside. Now, just like reading fiction novels, napping can increase your intelligence even if the nap or reading session wasn't triggered by your high intelligence. And that's because that research shows that even a brief nap shows significant improvement in memory retention, logical thinking, decision-making, and creativity. Meaning that this is something that you can actively experiment with and try implementing into your creative process if you ever end up feeling burnt out or simply stuck on an idea or problem. It may sound counterintuitive, but the next time you're really stuck on some work, try not thinking harder about it, but literally going to sleep on it. Not all night, but set an alarm for 15 or 20 minutes and and see how you feel afterwards. Now, there's a chance that you might just end up feeling groggy and worse for wear, which isn't necessarily uncommon, although if you are one of the individuals that benefits from a short nap, then definitely take advantage of the, well, boost you can get from this nap. Because a good nap is really the closest thing we have to an all-natural, healthy, organic, creativity-boosting, brain-boosting pill. And the best part is, it's free. So yeah, even though there's a plethora of reasons of why adults nap, the reality is that no matter what the situation is, napping does have a net positive effect on your cognitive function, and people with high intelligence are more inclined to nap during the day due to the mental stress that they are typically under with demanding work or even default thought processes. So the next time you see your drunk uncle passed out on the couch at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, don't judge him for being lazy. Understand that that man is a genius who knows how to make math. Like, that's impressive. That's science right there. He's literally the next Einstein. Just look at his desk. It's a mess too. Seeking information. If you watch the Trusty Bro YouTube channel, it's because you like to learn about interesting things. And luckily for you, I make videos about interesting things every single week. And did you know that it's scientifically proven, because I said so right now, that watching a Trusty Bro video is actually a sign of high intelligence? Because if you're seeking out new information, that means that you have a mind that is, well, wanting to learn and grow. And if you ask me for my completely unbiased opinion, that makes you sound like a genius in my books. So, if you like learning and you like the fun format of, well, my videos, feel free to subscribe and become a bro. We're on the road to 2 million subscribers, and believe it or not, nearly 75% of you guys watching this are not even subscribed. And at this point, you might be asking yourself, wait, was this whole section just to get a subscription? And the answer is yes. And the reason you figured that out is because you're a genius, which kind of bolsters my theory that people that watch Trust Me Bro are just natural geniuses. Subscription shilling aside, let's actually move on. Background noise brainiac. Let me paint a picture. You're tired, you want to go to bed, but you just can't sleep without putting on the right background noise. Maybe it's rain sounds. Maybe it's a Trust Me Bro compilation. Maybe it's anything. But you know you're not going to get a good night's sleep without your background noise. Let me paint another picture. You know that you have to lock in on a lot of work. Maybe it's schoolwork, maybe it's your career. Regardless, you've got a lot on your plate, but you are just struggling to lock in. That is, until you put on the right binaural beats or brown noise, and all of a sudden, you are simply ready to lock in. I don't know about you, but for me, this is one that I definitely relate to, because having the right background noise can definitely take my focus from a 0 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10 with simply a few clicks on YouTube. With background noise specifically, some highly intelligent people use background noise because it helps their brain function at an optimal level with the right sensory input. For some people, believe it or not, complete silence can actually be distracting, and in some cases, even unnatural feeling. And this is because some intelligent minds are just racing at times, meaning that when they are exposed to silence, they are actually exposed to a plethora of previously unheard thoughts. Now, with some background noise, like some soft music, binaural beats, ambient noise, or whatever it may be, you can effectively regulate your brain's mental activity by providing just enough mental stimulation to keep your brain engaged without overwhelming it. And there's a fine line there, because I've definitely noticed that if I use the wrong content to try to regulate my brain, in which for me is typically anything with more than one person talking, I notice that I actually don't focus more, I get more distracted. But that's just me. Maybe I'm not able to, compute all of that input. Regardless, using background noise to help you focus essentially helps you get into a cognitive flow state, which will help boost your focus, productivity, and problem-solving abilities. So, if you're somebody who consistently finds himself putting on background noise, whether it be in a work environment, a sleep environment, or even just a chill environment to keep your brain stimulated, it's likely because your brain is more powerful than you even know. And the reason why you're putting on this background noise is to subconsciously regulate your brain, because silence for you can sometimes be overwhelming because of how active your brain is, which is definitely interesting. And if this is eye-opening for you, then I want to share a few tips. A lot of what we learned in this video kind of shows that your brain can definitely be powerful, but also in a negative way if you don't learn to control it. Which is why this is not necessarily part of the video, but I just really want to recommend 2 things that have really helped me. One, I mentioned it earlier, look up binaural beats or brown noise on YouTube. There's a bunch of different frequencies you can listen to that actually are proven to help your brain. Brown noise is a different type of frequency that literally kind of turns off mental clutter. It's similar to white noise, but it's brown. I don't know what the difference is, but I just prefer brown noise. And beyond that, I just want to say, if you actively find yourself being overstimulated, like I am right now, to be quite frank, or feel yourself overwhelmed with life and thoughts and tasks and work, let me recommend one habit: meditation. I know it sounds like woo-woo and it's hard to do, but literally just go on YouTube and look up 5-minute meditation or guided meditation, or even watch a tutorial on how to meditate. Understand that if you've been watching this video and you feel like you may have a high intelligence based off of some of the things I've said, then I would suggest trying to form a better relationship with your newly discovered powerful brain and super intelligence. Because realistically, your brain can be your biggest asset and also potentially your worst enemy. But maybe that's a video I can make another time, because I also had the idea for a video about things that are actually signs of mental illness. So if you would like to see that video or a part 2 to this video, let me know in the comments.